Hello, welcome to the channel. Before starting the story, I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel. It's very important to me. Also, leave a comment telling me which city you're watching from. I'd love to know. Click the like button. All of this because, under the vast expanse of a star-studded sky, Mike stood at the edge of a stunning overlook in Pisgah National Forest, the cool night air wrapping around him like a gentle embrace. His heart raced with the thrill of anticipation as he set up his camera, a well-worn DSLR that had accompanied him on countless adventures. He meticulously adjusted the tripod, ensuring that it was steady on the uneven ground, while the faint sounds of the forest whispered around him. The moon hung low in the sky, casting silvery beams through the gnarled branches of ancient trees. The landscape was bathed in an ethereal glow, and Mike could hardly contain his excitement. This was his sanctuary, a place where he could immerse himself in the beauty of nature and translate that beauty into art. With a deep breath, he began to frame his shot, his fingers deftly working the dials and buttons, adjusting the exposure and focus. "Tonight's the night," he murmured to himself, a smile creeping across his face. "I can feel it." The rustling of leaves nearby caught his attention, pulling him from his reverie. He paused, his breath hitching slightly. The sound was faint but persistent, like something, or someone, was moving through the underbrush. Mike turned his head slightly, straining to listen, his heart thumping in rhythm with the rustling. It could be a deer or perhaps just the wind playing tricks on him, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. "Hello," he called out tentatively, his voice echoing into the stillness, swallowed by the dark. No response came, only the soft murmurs of the forest. He shook his head, laughing nervously at himself. "Get a grip, Mike. It's just the woods." He returned to his camera, adjusting the lens one last time. Just as he was about to press the shutter, a sudden flicker of darkness enveloped him. His flashlight, the reliable companion that had illuminated many of his nocturnal excursions, sputtered and died. The abrupt silence that followed was deafening, and Mike's heart raced as the shadows closed in around him, thick and suffocating. "Damn it," he cursed under his breath. Panic began to gnaw at him as he fumbled in his bag for a backup flashlight, but his fingers brushed against nothing but the cool metal of his tripod. He had forgotten it in the car, a rookie mistake he had never made before. "Okay, think. You can do this, just breathe," he whispered, trying to calm the rising tide of anxiety. With the forest now a cavern of darkness, every sound felt amplified, every rustle a potential threat. He leaned against the trunk of a nearby tree, closing his eyes for a moment to gather his thoughts. "I just need to get back to camp," he reassured himself, though the way back was now lost to him in the ink-black void. He took a step forward, the ground uneven beneath his boots, each twig and leaf crunching audibly in the silence. As he ventured deeper into the forest, he relied on his other senses, listening intently to the night sounds that surrounded him. The hoot of an owl echoed in the distance, while the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the scent of pine and damp earth. "Just follow the sounds," he muttered, taking another cautious step. The anxiety that had gripped him began to morph into a strange exhilaration, a primal instinct kicking in as he embraced the darkness. As he moved, however, the rustling from earlier returned, more pronounced this time. It was as if something was tracking him, lurking just beyond his line of sight. Mike's breath quickened again, and he instinctively quickened his pace. "It's probably just a raccoon or something," he reassured himself, trying to suppress the tightening knot in his stomach. But deep down, a flicker of dread ignited, urging him to move faster. Come on, Mike, you've got this, he chanted under his breath, trying to bolster his confidence. He recalled stories of the forest, tales of those who had wandered too far and never returned, their echoes lost to the shadows. You're not one of them, he insisted, though the shadows seemed to creep closer with each step. Suddenly, a sharp crack of a branch echoed behind him, and Mike froze, his heart pounding in his chest. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice shaky but loud. No answer came, just the rustling of leaves, now sounding almost sinister in the oppressive darkness. He felt the urge to turn and flee, but he fought against it, planting his feet firmly on the ground. "Just the wind," he whispered, but the words felt hollow and unconvincing. He resumed his trek, moving with a heightened sense of awareness, each sound now a potential threat. He wished for the comforting beam of his flashlight, for the illumination that had always guided his way. As he navigated the twisted roots and underbrush, Mike's mind began to race with thoughts of what could be lurking in the darkness. Was it a bear? A mountain lion? Or perhaps something more sinister? He shook his head, trying to dismiss the wild imaginings. "Focus, Mike. Just get back to camp," he urged himself, though the words felt increasingly desperate. Every step felt like a step deeper into a haunting abyss. The forest was no longer just a place of beauty, it had transformed into a maze of shadows and uncertainty. Just as he thought he might have found his bearings, he stumbled, tripping over a hidden root and landing hard on the ground. Pain shot through his knee, but he ignored it, scrambling back to his feet, his heart racing with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. "Okay, that was dumb," he muttered, brushing the dirt from his pants. The darkness seemed to close in tighter now, and he felt the weight of the night pressing down on him, an invisible force urging him to turn back. "Where's the path?" he asked aloud, his voice trembling in the night air. He stood still for a moment, straining to hear any familiar sounds, the crackling of a campfire, the murmur of the stream nearby, but all he received was the haunting silence of the forest. The oppressive stillness was almost suffocating, and he felt the urge to call out again, to scream for help, but he swallowed it down, unsure of what might answer. "Maybe if I just keep walking," he decided, but even as he spoke, doubt crept in. How long had he been wandering? Minutes? Hours? Time felt fluid in the darkness, and the forest seemed to stretch endlessly before him. Drawing in a shaky breath, Mike pressed on, determined to find his way back. He focused on the sounds of nature, trying to drown out the fear that clawed at his insides. The rustling continued, now almost rhythmic, as if something was pacing him, keeping time with his heartbeat. Just a few more steps, he reassured himself, but the words felt increasingly like a lie. He could feel the weight of the night bearing down on him, the shadows thickening as he moved deeper into the woods. "Come on, Mike. You're a night photographer, this is what you love," he argued, but the passion that usually fueled him felt distant, overshadowed by the creeping dread of the unknown. He took another cautious step forward, his senses heightened, and suddenly, the rustling stopped. It was an eerie silence, one that sent chills down his spine. "Hello," he called again, more forcefully this time, but the only reply was the echo of his own voice bouncing back at him, mocking and empty. "Damn it," he hissed, frustration mixing with fear. He was losing control, losing his way, and the darkness felt alive around him. It was as if the forest itself was watching, waiting for him to make a mistake. With a surge of determination, Mike pressed on, his focus narrowing on a faint sound in the distance, a trickle of water, perhaps. He had to find something familiar, a landmark that could guide him back to the safety of his campsite. Just keep moving, he urged himself, the words slipping into a mantra as he trudged forward. He felt the forest shifting around him, the trees closing in, and he couldn't shake the sensation that he was not alone. With each step, the shadows loomed larger, and the air grew colder, wrapping around him like a shroud. The thrill of adventure had morphed into a sense of impending doom, and Mike felt the weight of the darkness bearing down on him, threatening to swallow him whole. Mike's heart raced as he stood in the pitch-black darkness of Pisgah National Forest, the sudden silence of the night pressing in around him like a suffocating blanket. His flashlight, a reliable companion in his nocturnal adventures, had betrayed him at the worst possible moment. He cursed under his breath, his fingers fumbling through the gears strewn across the ground. Every piece of equipment had been meticulously organized, but now panic clouded his mind, making it impossible to think clearly. "Why didn't I pack a backup?" he muttered, frustration boiling over as he rummaged through his camera bag. The cold, damp air wrapped around him, a reminder of the vulnerability he felt in this vast, unknowable wilderness. The shadows loomed heavier, and the rustling of leaves seemed to echo his growing unease. He could have sworn he felt eyes watching him from the depths of the forest. Taking a deep breath, Mike forced himself to calm down. "Okay, just breathe," he whispered, the sound of his own voice providing a small comfort in the oppressive darkness. "You've done this 100 times. Just find your way back to camp." He remembered the route he had taken to set up his camera at the overlook, but now it felt like the forest had transformed into a maze, its familiar paths swallowed by the night. He strained his ears to catch any sounds that could guide him. The gentle rustle of leaves, the distant call of a night owl, and the soft whisper of the wind became his only allies as he stepped cautiously forward, trying to feel the ground beneath his feet. Suddenly, a sharp crunch echoed as he stepped on a twig. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest like a war drum. "Was that just me?" he questioned, glancing over his shoulder into the blackness. "Or is there something, or someone else out there?" The thought sent a shiver racing down his spine. "Get a grip, Mike," he chided himself, shaking off the creeping dread. He needed to focus. He took another step, and then another, his feet moving carefully over the uneven ground. The moonlight, when it managed to peek through the thick canopy of branches above, cast ghostly shadows that danced and flickered, distorting his sense of space and direction. As he moved deeper into the forest, the sounds of the night took on a different tone. The owl's calls became more pronounced, the rustling of small creatures in the underbrush sounded like whispers conspiring in the dark. Mike felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, as if the forest itself was alive with secrets, watching and waiting. "It's just your imagination," he told himself, but the words felt weak against the weight of his growing anxiety. "Just keep walking. You'll find the trail," he reiterated, trying to latch onto any semblance of logic in the surreal atmosphere. He reached into his pocket, grasping at the small compass he always carried. It was a simple tool, but it provided a sliver of reassurance. The needle wavered slightly, but it pointed north, and he decided to trust it. With renewed determination, Mike continued his trek, trying to remember the landmarks he had passed earlier. A particularly gnarled tree, the small stream that trickled nearby, the rocky outcrop that marked the edge of his campsite. Each step felt like a small victory, yet the darkness around him remained impenetrable, shifting with each sound that pierced the quiet. Just as he rounded a bend, he stumbled upon a small clearing. The moonlight spilled into the space, illuminating patches of wildflowers that swayed gently in the breeze. It was beautiful, but Mike's relief was short-lived. The stillness was unsettling, and he felt an inexplicable urge to move on. "Is anyone out there?" he called out, his voice echoing into the void, swallowed by the night. The silence that followed was deafening, amplifying his isolation. He shuddered, realizing how alone he truly was in this vast wilderness. "Mike," a voice suddenly pierced the stillness, sending a jolt of adrenaline through him. He spun around, heart racing. "Is that you?" His pulse quickened as he strained to see through the darkness. "Who's there?" he shouted back, trying to keep the tremor out of his voice. The forest, once merely a backdrop to his photography, now felt like a living entity, aware of his fear and feeding off it. "Mike." "It's Clara," came the voice again, clearer this time, filled with urgency. Relief washed over him as he recognized the name. Clara was a fellow photographer he had met at a workshop months ago. "Where are you?" "I'm here." He started, but before he could finish, Clara emerged from the shadows, her silhouette illuminated by the pale moonlight. She looked disheveled, her hair tousled and her clothes slightly torn, as if she had been in a struggle with the forest itself. "Thank God I found you," she exclaimed, rushing toward him. "I've been searching everywhere." "What are you doing out here?" Mike asked, bewildered. "I thought I was the only one." "I thought so too," Clara replied, her voice trembling. "I came out for some night shots, and, well, things got strange. I could hear whispers, like the forest was trying to tell me something." "Whispers?" Mike repeated, his heart pounding once more. "I heard them too. It felt like the trees were alive." "Yes." Clara nodded, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and excitement. "There's something about this place, something hidden beneath the surface. I saw visions, flashes of people, of events long gone, like the forest holds their memories." Mike's mind raced, trying to process her words. "What do you mean, visions?" "I don't know," Clara admitted, shaking her head as if trying to dispel the thoughts swirling within. "I just felt drawn to them. It's like the forest is a doorway to another time." A chill ran down Mike's spine. He had come to capture the beauty of the forest under the stars, not to delve into its mysteries. "We need to get back to camp," he urged, glancing nervously into the darkness. "I don't like this place anymore." "Wait," Clara said, her voice filled with urgency. "We can't just leave. I feel like we're close to something important. Look." She pointed toward a cluster of trees, their gnarled branches twisting like skeletal fingers against the night sky. "Can't you feel it?" Mike hesitated, torn between the instinct to flee and the pull of curiosity. "I don't know, Clara. Something doesn't feel right." "I know it's scary, but we can't ignore it," she insisted, her voice steadying as she stepped closer to him. "What if we miss something incredible? Or what if we get lost again?" he countered, the tension between them palpable. Clara took a deep breath, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made him rethink his initial instinct. "Together, we can face whatever's out there. But alone? The forest is unforgiving." Reluctantly, Mike nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "Okay, but let's be quick. If we find anything strange, we turn back." "Deal," Clara agreed, a flicker of determination igniting in her gaze. They moved deeper into the woods, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. The air felt charged, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. As they walked, Mike couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, the shadows around them deepening with each passing moment. There. Clara suddenly pointed toward a narrow path winding between the trees, barely visible in the darkness. "Let's check that out." "Are you sure?" Mike asked, unease gnawing at him. "Yes. Come on," Clara urged, already stepping onto the path. With a resigned sigh, Mike followed, uncertainty gnawing at him. The path was overgrown, branches reaching out like fingers trying to pull them back. Every crack of a twig and rustle of leaves heightened his senses. It felt like they were intruding on something sacred, something that had been hidden away for far too long. As they ventured further, the air grew cooler, the night thickening with an otherworldly quality. Mike felt the hairs on his arms stand on end, a primal instinct telling him they should turn back. But Clara pressed onward, her curiosity a fierce flame against the encroaching darkness. "Just a little further," she encouraged, glancing back at him with that same spark of determination. "All right, but if we don't find anything soon, we're heading back," he warned, his voice firm despite the thrill of adventure creeping in. "Deal," Clara echoed, and together they stepped further into the unknown, the whispers of the forest growing louder around them, as if urging them forward into the depths of its secrets. Mike stumbled through the dense underbrush of Pisgah National Forest, each step becoming increasingly tentative as he tried to orient himself in the thick darkness that enveloped him. The moonlight barely penetrated the towering trees, casting elongated shadows that danced ominously around him. He could hear the rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of twigs, sounds that heightened his anxiety. It felt as though the forest itself was alive, watching him with unseen eyes. His heart raced, and his breath came in short gasps as he navigated the terrain with only the faintest memory of the trail he had taken earlier. Despite his years of experience as a night photographer, the darkness felt different now, more oppressive, more sinister. The thrill of capturing the ethereal beauty of the stars had transformed into an overwhelming sense of isolation and fear. After what felt like an eternity of stumbling and grasping at branches, Mike caught sight of something ahead, a clearing. His mind raced with hope as he pushed through the last of the underbrush and emerged into the open space. What he found there, however, sent a chill coursing through him. Before him lay an abandoned campsite. The remnants of a fire pit were barely discernible beneath a layer of fallen leaves, and a few scattered rocks seemed to form a crude circle around it. Old, weather-beaten tents lay crumpled on the ground, their fabric torn and faded, as if they had been forgotten long ago. It was a haunting sight, and Mike felt an unsettling sense of foreboding wash over him. "Hello?" Mike called out, his voice trembling slightly in the stillness. The only reply was the whisper of the wind through the trees. He took a tentative step closer, curiosity tugging at him despite the unease that settled in his stomach. As he moved around the campsite, he noticed an old camera partially buried in the dirt. It was a vintage model, caked with grime and leaves, its leather casing cracked and peeling. Mike felt an inexplicable connection to it, almost as if it was beckoning him to uncover its story. He knelt down, brushing away the dirt with his fingers. "Who are you?" he murmured, half to himself, as he examined the camera. It had been clearly left behind in haste, and a shiver ran down his spine at the thought of the photographer who might have abandoned it. Did they leave in a hurry? Had something frightened them away? Suddenly, a faint whisper broke the silence, carried on the night breeze, making Mike's heart skip a beat. He straightened up, scanning the trees around him, but saw nothing. The whisper felt like a warning, a soft breath against his ear that urged him to leave this place. "Get a grip, Mike," he muttered, shaking his head as if to dispel the creeping dread. He stood up, clutching the old camera in his hands, feeling the weight of its history. Just then, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves with a sudden ferocity, and Mike's instincts screamed at him to vacate the campsite immediately. He turned to leave, but his foot caught on a root, sending him sprawling onto the ground. The camera slipped from his grasp, hitting the ground with a thud that echoed in the silence. Damn it, he cursed under his breath, pushing himself up. He glanced back at the camera, now partially obscured by the underbrush, and felt a pang of regret. As he stood there, breathing heavily, the whisper returned, more pronounced this time, swirling around him like a ghostly presence. "Leave, now," it seemed to say, and Mike felt a chill run down his spine. He could almost make out words in the rustling leaves, a soft plea that sent shivers throughout his body. "No more," he said, shaking his head defiantly. "I'm not staying here." He took a step back, intending to retrace his steps back to the path he had come from, but as he turned, a sense of disorientation washed over him. The trees surrounding him seemed to shift, their trunks twisting in the shadows, and the world felt strangely unreal. With a burst of adrenaline, Mike sprinted away from the campsite, navigating through the darkness with sheer instinct. Every snap of a twig and rustle of leaves felt magnified, each sound echoing in the eerie stillness of the forest. He focused on putting one foot in front of the other, trying to remember the direction he had come from. "Just keep moving," he whispered to himself, forcing his legs to carry him forward. "You'll find your way back." But the deeper he went into the woods, the more he sensed the forest closing in around him. It was as if the trees were leaning in, whispering secrets and warnings that he couldn't quite grasp. Panic clawed at his throat as he stumbled over roots and rocks, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He felt the weight of the darkness pressing down on him, suffocating and relentless. "Please," he pleaded into the night, his voice trembling. "I just want to get back." The vulnerability of his situation settled over him like a heavy blanket. He was alone in the vast wilderness, with nothing but the haunting memories of the abandoned campsite and that old camera. As he pressed on, he recalled all the stories he had heard about Pisgah National Forest. Tales of hikers who had disappeared without a trace, swallowed by the shadows of the trees. Had he stepped into a realm beyond the ordinary? He could almost hear the whispers of their ghosts, echoing in the recesses of his mind. "Stay focused," he admonished himself, shaking his head as he fought against the encroaching panic. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the darkness, but all he found was solitude. Yet even in that solitude, he felt a presence, an awareness that he was not entirely alone. The forest, with its towering trees and thick underbrush, felt sentient, as if it were alive and watching his every move. The thought sent shivers down his spine, but he forced himself to push forward, driven by a relentless need to escape. After what felt like hours of navigating through the dark, Mike finally spotted a flicker of light in the distance. Hope surged within him, and he quickened his pace, heart racing with the possibility of finding safety. "Please, let that be my campsite," he murmured, the words barely audible over the pounding of his heart. But as he drew closer, the light flickered and faded, leaving him once again engulfed in darkness. Desperation clawed at him. "No. Not again." He stumbled, his foot catching on a hidden root, and he fell to the ground, the breath knocked out of him. As he lay there, staring up at the canopy of leaves above, he felt utterly defeated. The forest had become a labyrinth, twisting and turning in ways he could not comprehend. He had lost his sense of direction, and the weight of the night pressed heavily on his chest. "Is anyone there?" he called out, his voice tinged with desperation. The only response was the whispering wind, which seemed to mock him with its haunting echoes. He could feel the cold seeping into his bones, the chill of the forest wrapping around him like a shroud. "Come on, Mike," he muttered to himself, pushing up from the ground. He had to keep moving, to find his way back to the safety of his campsite. He took a deep breath, steadying his racing heart, and began to make his way through the darkness once more, determined to escape the clutches of the forest. With each step, he could feel the atmosphere shift around him, the woods alive with a palpable energy. Shadows flickered at the edges of his vision, and he could swear he heard faint whispers carried by the wind, urging him to turn back. But Mike pressed on, fueled by a mixture of fear and determination. "Just a little further," he said aloud, his voice barely breaking the silence. "You can do this." As he continued to navigate the maze of trees, he felt the weight of the camera in his pocket, a reminder of the abandoned campsite and the mysteries that lay within the forest. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being tested, that the forest was revealing its secrets in a way he had never anticipated. As he moved deeper into the woods, the air grew thick with tension, and the whispers intensified, swirling around him like a tempest. Mike's heart raced, and his instincts screamed for him to turn back. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the brink of something monumental, a revelation that would change everything he thought he knew about the forest and himself. And so, with every ounce of courage he could muster, Mike forged ahead, ready to confront whatever lay hidden in the darkness, determined to uncover the truth behind the unsettling whispers and the long-abandoned campsite that had drawn him into this eerie night. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an ethereal glow over the Pisgah National Forest. Shadows danced among the towering trees, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Mike, now deep into the forest, felt the weight of darkness around him. The whispers that had been mere echoes at the fringes of his awareness were now a cacophony. They ebbed and flowed with the wind, weaving in and out of his consciousness, each fluttering sound piercing into his thoughts. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling slightly in the stillness. The only response was the rustling of leaves, as if the forest itself was sighing. He pressed on, each step more cautious than the last. The ground beneath him was uneven, roots and rocks threatening to trip him again. The shapes he thought he had seen lurking in the shadows were now mere figments of his imagination, yet they fed into his growing paranoia. The stories he had heard about hikers who vanished in these woods flooded back to him, each tale more chilling than the last. The woods felt alive, watching him, judging him. "Just a little further," he murmured to himself, trying to steady his racing heart. "I can find my way back." But the forest had other plans. Mike stumbled forward, the tripping roots catching him off guard. He fell hard onto the damp earth, the breath knocked out of him. Pain lanced through his knee, but it was the darkness that truly enveloped him, tightening around him like a vice. He lay there for a moment, trying to gather himself, the whispering voices swirling in his mind. "Get up," he grunted, forcing himself onto his hands and knees. The ground was cool against his palms, the scent of moist earth and decaying leaves filling his nostrils. He could hear his heartbeat, a relentless drum in the rhythmic silence of the forest, punctuated only by the occasional hoot of an owl. As he rose slowly, the whispers seemed to crescendo, flooding his mind with a sense of urgency. He could almost discern words, though they remained elusive. "Help, leave, dark," each phrase echoed ominously, leaving an unsettling residue in the air. "Stop it," he shouted into the void, his voice reverberating against the trees. "I'm not afraid of you." But he was afraid. The darkness was suffocating, and he could feel the chill creeping into his bones. He needed to move. He needed to find something, anything, that would guide him back. He steadied himself and began to walk, this time more aware of each sound, each rustle around him. As he moved deeper into the forest, the shapes he thought he saw began to shift, morphing into more distinct forms. They flickered at the edge of his vision, darting just out of reach. "Is someone there?" he called again, desperation creeping into his voice. "I could use a little help." The only answer was the soft rustle of leaves, but he could have sworn he heard laughter, a soft, mocking sound that sent chills down his spine. The whispers now melded into a haunting melody of unintelligible words, luring him further into the depths of the forest. He pressed on, each step heavier than the last. The trees loomed larger, their trunks thick and gnarled, twisted by time and the elements. The moonlight filtered through the canopy, creating patches of silver on the forest floor, illuminating the way just enough for him to stumble ahead. "Just keep moving," he urged himself, trying to drown out the voices. "You'll find your way back. It's just a forest." But as he spoke, a deep sense of foreboding settled in his chest. This was no ordinary forest. Suddenly, a flash of light caught his eye, glimmering through the trees. Hope surged within him. A trail, he thought, rushing toward it. But as he broke through the brush, he found himself standing before a massive tree, its trunk wide enough that he could barely wrap his arms around it. The light he had seen was nothing more than a reflection of the moon on a puddle at its base. Mike leaned against the tree, panting. It was a momentary respite from the chaos swirling in his mind. "Okay, think. You've got this," he whispered, trying to gather his thoughts. "What's the plan?" At that moment, the whispers escalated, rising in pitch and urgency. "Leave," they cried, the voices intertwining, creating a chilling symphony. "Go back." "Why are you doing this?" he shouted, frustration boiling over. "I just want to get home." The forest responded with an eerie silence, the kind that pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. Mike closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to center himself. "Focus," he muttered. "Focus on the sounds. Focus on your surroundings." He opened his eyes and scanned the area. The trees were almost oppressive, their branches creating a web overhead that obscured the stars. He knew he needed to find a way to navigate back. "If I can just find a landmark," he thought, but even as he spoke, doubt crept in. He had no idea how far he had strayed from his original path. Then, from behind him, he heard a faint sound, like a twig snapping underfoot. He whipped around, heart racing. "Who's there?" he demanded, feeling foolish for trying to sound brave. "Mike," a voice called out, tentative and familiar. It sent a jolt of recognition through him. "Is that you?" he responded, straining to see through the darkness. "Who's there?" "Mike, it's Clara," she said, her voice breaking slightly. She stepped into the moonlight, her silhouette barely visible. "I was looking for you." Relief washed over him momentarily, but it was quickly replaced by confusion. "Clara? What are you doing here?" "I thought you might need help," she replied, her voice trembling. "I heard about the storm and wanted to make sure you were okay. But when I got here, I couldn't find you." Mike took a step closer, examining her face, which was pale and drawn. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said lightly, trying to break the tension. "I might as well have," she replied, glancing around nervously. "This place, it's different. I've been feeling things, seeing things." "What do you mean?" he asked, curiosity peaking despite the fear that lingered in the air. I don't know how to explain it, she admitted. It's like I can feel the history here, the weight of those who've come before us. Mike frowned, the air heavy with her words. You mean, like the hikers who went missing? Yes, she exclaimed, her eyes wide. It's like their stories are woven into the very fabric of the forest. I can hear them calling out, begging for help. Clara, that sounds, he started, but she cut him off, her voice rising in urgency. We need to leave, Mike. Now. The forest doesn't want us here. He opened his mouth to argue, but the intensity in her eyes made him hesitate. What do you mean it doesn't want us here? It's hard to explain, but the energy here is unsettling. It feels alive. It feels hungry, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He glanced around, the shadows seeming to crawl closer, the whispers intensifying once again. You're right, he conceded. We should find a way out. Follow me, Clara urged, turning swiftly, her footsteps light as she navigated through the underbrush. Mike hurried after her, the darkness pressing in around them. As they moved, the whispers began to coalesce into a discernible rhythm, a haunting chorus that echoed through the trees. Leave, leave, it seemed to chant, a relentless reminder of their precarious situation. Clara, do you hear that? Mike asked, trying to keep pace with her. Yes, she replied, her expression grim. It's trying to lure us deeper. We must resist. Resist what? He pressed, fear creeping back into his voice. Whatever is out there, she said, glancing over her shoulder, her eyes wide with apprehension. We need to stay together. Don't let it separate us. They quickened their pace, the forest around them shifting and twisting, the trees appearing to close in as they moved deeper into the night. Mike felt the weight of Clara's presence beside him, a tether in a growing chaos. Do you think we'll find the camp? He asked, trying to keep the conversation flowing, grounding himself in the familiarity of their shared experiences. I hope so, she replied, though her voice held a note of uncertainty. But right now, we need to focus on getting out of here. Stay close. As they pressed on, the whispers morphed into a single voice, clearer yet more menacing, echoing through the trees. Stay, stay, it beckoned, each repetition sending shivers down their spines. Mike felt panic rise within him, a primal instinct to flee, but he fought against it. Keep moving, he urged, determination igniting within him. We can make it. Clara nodded, her grip tightening on the strap of her camera. They pressed forward, navigating the labyrinth of trees, the shadows playing tricks on the night enveloped Mike like a shroud, the darkness thick and heavy, a palpable entity that pressed in on him from all sides. He blinked against the void, striving to regain his bearings after the fall, but the familiar contours of the forest had transformed into an unfamiliar maze. Rising to his feet, he brushed off the dirt and leaves that clung to his clothes, the chill of the night air prickling against his skin. He felt a surge of determination, ignited by the flickering remnants of fear. Stay calm, he murmured to himself, the sound of his own voice echoing back at him, oddly distorted in the silence that surrounded him. The forest had a way of amplifying sounds, and his words morphed into an unsettling chorus, mocking him. I just need to find my way back. Mike took a deep breath, trying to center himself. His heart raced the longer he stood in the thickening darkness, the shadows seeming to pulse and shift all around him. He strained his ears, listening for any sounds that might indicate the direction of his campsite, the crackle of a campfire, the distant rustle of leaves stirred by the wind, or perhaps the soft murmur of a stream. Instead, All he heard was the low hum of the night, the occasional chirp of a distant cricket, and the unsettling quiet that followed his own voice. The path he had followed earlier was nowhere to be seen, swallowed by the encroaching underbrush. It was as if the forest had conspired against him, reshaping itself into a labyrinth, each turn leading him deeper into its embrace. In his gut, he felt the tightening spiral of dread, an instinctive warning that something was amiss. "Okay, think, Mike," he said, brushing his fingers through his hair in frustration. "You can do this." He took a tentative step forward, hoping to find any familiar landmark, a fallen tree, a rock formation, anything that might guide him. Each step felt like a gamble, the undergrowth crackling beneath his boots, whispering secrets he couldn't decipher. The shadows around him seemed to stretch and contract, the trees towering like ancient sentinels, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. As he moved cautiously, he recalled the stories he had heard about Pisgah National Forest, tales of lost hikers and vanishing souls. The wind carried with it a low, mournful sound, like the forest itself lamenting its hidden tragedies. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig beneath his feet, heightened his anxiety. "Hello," he called out, his voice trembling slightly as it cut through the thick silence. "Is anyone there?" The word lingered in the air, swallowed by the darkness. No reply came, just the echo of his own voice, twisted and distant. He felt a chill race down his spine, as if the forest itself were listening, gauging his fear. Mike pressed on, each movement deliberate as he scanned the surrounding trees for any sign of a path. He thought he could make out shapes in the shadows, fleeting glimpses that danced at the edges of his vision. He stopped, squinting into the darkness, convinced he saw movement, a flicker of light, or perhaps just a trick of the light. His heart thudded in his chest as he strained to see clearer, but the moment passed, leaving him alone with the oppressive silence. "Just keep moving," he muttered, a chant to ward off the rising panic. He decided to head downhill, reasoning that the sound of water might lead him back to the stream he had crossed earlier. But with each step, the ground beneath him felt increasingly treacherous, the roots of trees tangling around his feet like skeletal fingers. Suddenly, a whisper, soft and indistinct, brushed past him, carried on the night breeze. He froze, his breath hitching in his throat. "What was that?" he whispered to the shadows. The whisper came again, clearer this time, a sibilant sound that seemed to beckon him closer. "Leave, now!" The voice sent a jolt of fear coursing through him, and he shook his head, trying to dispel the hallucinations born of panic and darkness. "It's just the wind," he told himself, though doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. He turned on his heel, desperate to distance himself from the spectral voices that haunted the night. As he pushed through the undergrowth, he stumbled upon a clearing, the moonlight breaking through the canopy, casting a silvery glow on the ground. Relief washed over him, momentarily dispelling the shadows that clung to him. Yet, the tranquility was short-lived. The quiet felt unnatural, charged with an unsettling energy that made his skin crawl. In the center of the clearing stood a gnarled tree, its branches twisted and knotted like the fingers of a forgotten giant. Beneath it lay remnants of an old campfire, the stones blackened and cracked, remnants of a past life long extinguished. A chill ran through him as he approached, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and fading smoke. "Is anyone here?" he called out again, half hoping for a response, half fearing what might answer. The only answer was the rustling of leaves, a soft sigh that felt almost human. He knelt beside the remnants of the fire, peering into the ashes, trying to discern the stories they held. Was this a campsite of those who had come before him? Had they too wandered into the woods, lured by the same beauty he sought? God, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. I need to get back. This isn't right. He stood up, scanning the clearing once more, and it was then that he noticed something glinting beneath the tree, a metallic object half buried in the dirt. Curiosity piqued, he moved closer, kneeling down to brush away the soil. As the dirt fell away, a camera emerged, its lens cracked and covered in grime. Mike's heart raced. What the? He gingerly picked it up, the weight of it feeling both familiar and alien in his hands. Memories of his own camera flooded back, his passion for capturing the night, the thrill of freezing a moment in time. But this camera felt different, its history steeped in mystery and sorrow. He turned it over, examining the worn strap and the faded logo. Who did this belong to? He whispered, as if the camera might somehow respond. The weight of its presence felt heavy, a reminder of the transient nature of life, of those who came to these woods and never left. Just then, a gust of wind swept through the clearing, rustling the leaves overhead. The whispering returned, louder this time, almost urgent. Leave, before it's too late. The words coiled around him like a vine, squeezing his chest with fear. He dropped the camera, watching as it hit the ground with a dull thud, the sound echoing in the stillness. No, he said, shaking his head violently. I can't stay here. He turned on his heel, ready to flee, when he caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of his eye, a flash of movement beyond the trees. It was just a shadow, but it felt alive, watching him, waiting. Who's there? He shouted, his voice rising in pitch. The forest remained silent, the only sound his own ragged breathing. He took off running, pushing himself through the underbrush, branches snapping and tearing at his clothes. Panic surged through him, a primal instinct driving him forward as adrenaline coursed through his veins. As he ran, he could hear the whispers growing louder, a cacophony of voices that seemed to echo through the trees. Leave, 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 they chanted, a haunting melody that wrapped around him, tugging at his sanity. He stumbled, tripping over roots that seemed to reach for him, pulling him deeper into the forest's embrace. Stop it, he yelled, desperation clawing at his throat. Just leave me alone. But the forest ignored his pleas, the shadows closing in around him, the whispers intertwining with the rustling leaves. Just as he felt he might lose his grip on reality, he broke through the dense foliage into another clearing, his heart pounding in his chest. He stumbled to a halt, gasping for breath, and looked around, trying to regain his bearings. The moonlight illuminated the area, revealing a series of ancient stones arranged in a circle, their surfaces etched with markings that seemed to pulse with energy. It was an altar of sorts, a forgotten piece of history hidden away in the woods. What is this place? He breathed, awe mingling with fear as he stepped closer, drawn to the stones. The atmosphere was thick, charged with an energy that sent shivers down his spine. He reached out to touch one of the stones, the surface cool and smooth beneath his fingertips. Leave, the whispers rose once more, now frantic, echoing in his mind. You must leave. Mike's instincts kicked in, and he withdrew his hand, stepping back from the stones as if they were alive. The shadows around him shifted, and for a moment, he felt a presence looming just beyond the edge of the clearing. The air grew colder, and he knew he couldn't linger any longer. Turning on his heel, he sprinted away from the stones, desperately searching for any sign of his path. He could feel the forest pulsing with life around him, the trees seeming to move, to watch, as he raced through the underbrush. The whispers faded into the night, but the weight of their warning pressed heavily on his mind. As he pushed deeper into the woods, The sense of disorientation began as Mike stumbled through the dense underbrush. He could feel the earth shifting beneath his feet. The darkness was no longer merely an absence of light. It had enveloped him, wrapping around his senses like a thick fog. Each rustle of leaves or snapped twig sent shivers down his spine, and he could almost hear the forest breathing, alive with secrets he was not meant to uncover. He had given up calling for help, realizing that even his own voice had become a stranger in this suffocating silence. Then, just as despair began to settle in, he broke through the thick foliage and into a clearing. He squinted against the moonlight, which illuminated the area in a ghostly glow. Standing there, in stark contrast to the fragile beauty around her, was a figure he recognized. Clara, a fellow photographer he had met at a workshop a few months back, stood before him, her face a mixture of relief and concern. Her hair was wild, and her clothes were torn, as if she had been wandering through the forest for days. "Mike," she called, her voice breaking the stillness. "I've been looking for you. I thought I'd never find you." "Clara," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" "I was trying to photograph the stars too," she said, stepping closer, her eyes wide with urgency. "But then I started seeing things, visions of the forest's past. I didn't know if I was dreaming or awake." Mike felt a pit form in his stomach. "Visions? What kind of visions?" "Souls," she breathed, glancing around the clearing as if the very trees were listening. "I saw them, people who never made it out of here. Their faces, they're trapped, Mike. Trapped between this world and the next." "Are you sure it's not just the darkness playing tricks on you?" he asked, trying to mask the tremor in his voice. The idea of what she described horrified him, but a part of him felt an overwhelming urge to believe her. After all, he had just experienced a night filled with terror and uncertainty. "No," she insisted, shaking her head. "I felt their pain, their longing. It's real. And I think they're trying to tell us something." Before he could respond, the ground beneath them began to tremble, a low rumble that resonated through the roots of the trees. Mike instinctively grabbed Clara's arm, his heart racing. "What's happening?" "I don't know," she gasped, pulling him toward the center of the clearing. "We need to get out of here." But as they moved, the tremors intensified, and the earth cracked open before them, revealing a dark void. Mike's breath caught in his throat as he peered into the chasm, horrified yet entranced. It was as if the forest itself was unveiling its hidden truths, forcing them to confront the past. "Look!" Clara shouted, pointing into the darkness. There, half buried beneath the soil, was a collection of objects, old, rusted trinkets, and pieces of fabric that had once been clothing. The air was thick with a heavy, mournful energy, as if the very ground was weeping for those who had been lost. Those are artifacts," Mike stammered, stepping closer. "They must belong to the people who vanished." "Yes," Clara said, her voice barely audible. "This is an ancient burial ground. This is where they were laid to rest." As the realization sank in, Mike felt a chill seep into his bones. The camera he had found earlier, the one that had sparked both curiosity and fear, now weighed heavily on his mind. "Clara, the camera I found, it belonged to you, didn't it?" She froze, her eyes widening. I don't know. I was lost here for so long. I remember taking pictures, but then everything went dark. I can't remember how I got here, or why I'm still here." "Clara," Mike said urgently, "we need to leave. Now." But as he turned to pull her away, A soft, ethereal voice echoed through the clearing. Stay. You must understand. The words hung in the air, wrapping around them like a cold embrace. Clara's eyes glazed over as if she were in a trance. They want us to know their stories, Mike. They want us to remember them. Remember them? How can we do that? He asked, desperation creeping into his tone. The camera, Clara said, her voice trembling. You need to use it. Capture their stories. Give them a voice. With a sinking heart, Mike reached into his bag and pulled out the old camera, its surface coated in a layer of dirt. It felt foreign in his hands, yet strangely familiar. But what if it doesn't work? What if I can't capture anything? Just try, Clara urged, her eyes pleading. You're a talented photographer. You can do this. As he looked through the viewfinder, Mike felt a shift in the air around him. The tremors subsided, replaced by an eerie calm that settled over the clearing. He took a deep breath, adjusting the focus, and pressed the shutter. The click echoed, sending ripples through the silence. Suddenly, images began to materialize in his mind, visions of the forest alive with people, laughter mingling with the rustle of leaves. He saw a woman, her face lit with joy, holding a child's hand as they explored the woods. Then, the scene shifted, shadows creeping in, enveloping them, leaving only the echo of their laughter behind. Do you see them? Clara whispered, her voice a mere breath. Yes, Mike replied, his heart racing. They're all around us. Images flowed through him, each one more vivid than the last. A group of friends gathered around a fire, their faces aglow with warmth, a young couple sharing a kiss beneath the stars, unaware of the dark shadows lurking just beyond the trees. He felt their joys, their hopes, and then their fears as the darkness closed in. I can't keep this to myself, he said, overwhelmed by the weight of the knowledge. I need to share this. They deserve to be remembered. Clara nodded fervently. Yes. You have to show others, Mike. Let them know that the forest holds stories, stories that need to be told. As he continued to photograph, the ethereal energy around them shifted once again. The air thickened, and he could hear whispers rising and falling like the tide. Thank you, a voice murmured, soft as a breeze. Mike's heart swelled with a mixture of fear and hope. We won't forget you, he promised, each word a vow echoing through the void. The visions began to fade, and the clearing shifted back into the familiar shadows of the forest. But Mike felt changed, as if a part of him had been awakened. He turned to Clara, her eyes glistening with tears. We need to find a way out, he said, determination flooding his voice. Yes, let's go, she replied, wiping her eyes. But we must remember what we've seen here. As they retraced their steps, the forest felt different, less like a foreboding labyrinth and more like a living entity, watching over them. With every step they took, the weight of the night lifted, and the path home became clearer. Do you think they'll be all right? Clara asked, glancing back at the clearing. I think they finally have a voice, Mike replied. And as long as we remember them, they'll never truly be lost. Together, they walked into the embrace of the trees, the moonlight guiding their way. The forest, once a place of fear and uncertainty, now felt like a sacred space, one filled with stories waiting to be told. And in that moment, Mike knew he would carry those stories with him, not just as a photographer, but as a guardian of the memories that lingered in the shadows. Emma stood in the heart of Gifford Pinchot National Forest, surrounded by towering pines and the enticing scent of earth and moss. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an amber glow that filtered through the leaves, creating a dappled pattern on the forest floor. Each step she took crunched softly underfoot, a reminder of the tranquility that enveloped this secluded part of Washington. Excitement bubbled within her chest as she surveyed her surroundings, eager to begin her solo camping trip dedicated to her passion for geology. With a determined stride, she made her way to a flat clearing nestled between two gnarled oaks. This spot felt right. It was shielded from the wind yet open enough to catch the last rays of sunlight. Emma unloaded her gear from her backpack, setting aside her research materials to focus on pitching her tent first. She had envisioned this trip for weeks, meticulously planning the data she wished to collect on seismic activity in the region. The thrill of being alone in nature, away from the bustling world, filled her with a sense of freedom. "All right, let's get this set up," she murmured to herself, her voice echoing slightly in the stillness. She unrolled the tent fabric, feeling its texture against her fingers as she spread it out across the ground. With practiced ease, she inserted the poles and secured the tent to the earth, a sense of accomplishment washing over her as it took shape. As the sun dipped lower, the forest transitioned into a different realm. Shadows grew longer, and the captivating sounds of chirping crickets and rustling leaves replaced the daytime chatter of birds. Emma took a moment to admire the view, the vibrant greens of the forest now muted under the burgeoning twilight. She felt invigorated, ready to document her geological observations. Once her tent was secured, she set up her portable lab on a nearby picnic table. The equipment gleamed in the fading light: seismometers, notebooks, and a few geological samples she had collected during her previous hikes. She meticulously arranged everything, allowing herself to indulge in the anticipation of the data she would gather. As she sat down to jot down her initial impressions, a sudden gust of wind swept through the trees, causing them to creak ominously. Emma looked up, her heart racing slightly at the unexpected sound. The forest, once a welcoming embrace, now felt unfamiliar and daunting. She brushed the feeling aside, attributing it to her overactive imagination. "It's just the wind," she reassured herself, forcing a smile as she returned to her notes. "You're a geologist, Emma. You're here to study the earth, not fear it." But as darkness enveloped the forest, the noises grew more pronounced, the creaking of branches echoing in the stillness. Emma felt a shiver run down her spine, an instinctual warning that perhaps she had ventured too far into solitude. The shadows danced at the corners of her vision, and she found herself glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking just out of sight. With night fully settled, Emma decided to distract herself with a small campfire. She gathered dry twigs and pine needles, carefully stacking them into a makeshift fire pit. As she struck a match, the flame flickered to life, casting a warm glow around her. The crackling of the fire momentarily drowned out the unsettling sounds of the forest. "See? Nothing to be scared of," she said aloud, her voice steadier now. She warmed her hands over the fire, feeling the heat radiate against her skin. The light flickered, illuminating her surroundings and creating an illusion of safety. As she sat there, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt charged, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. She glanced up at the stars, twinkling like distant diamonds, and tried to focus on the beauty of the moment. Yet, the unease lingered, a subtle tremor in her gut that she couldn't quite explain. Hours passed, and the forest grew quieter, the nocturnal creatures settling into their own rhythms. Emma felt her eyelids growing heavy, the exhaustion of the day catching up with her. She decided it was time to retreat into her tent, away from the unsettling stillness of the night. Inside her tent, she zipped the entrance closed, creating a barrier between herself and the encroaching darkness. The fabric felt thin against the might of the forest, but she tried to convince herself it would protect her. She lay down on her sleeping bag, pulling it snugly around her, and closed her eyes, willing sleep to come. Just as she began to drift off, a series of sharp, jarring sounds jolted her awake. The tent trembled slightly, and her heart raced as the noise persisted, echoing through the trees like distant thunder. Emma shot up, her pulse quickening. What was that? She whispered to herself, a bead of sweat forming on her brow. With a nervous breath, she unzipped the tent, the sound of the zipper slicing through the silence. The cool night air hit her, sending a shiver down her spine as she peered outside. The forest was cloaked in darkness, the shadows looming menacingly around her. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. There was no response, only the rustle of leaves in the wind. Emma took a cautious step outside, the ground firm beneath her feet. She scanned the area, her eyes straining to adjust to the limited light. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches swaying gently. Yet, the unsettling feeling remained, a nagging voice urging her to return to the safety of her tent. Just a deer or something, she tried to convince herself, but the rational explanation felt flimsy against the backdrop of her unease. As she took another step into the night, a low rumble rolled through the earth, vibrating beneath her feet. Emma stumbled slightly, her heart racing as the ground seemed to shift. Panic gripped her as she realized what this could mean. An active fault line? The thought sent a chill down her spine. What if I'm too close? What if there's an earthquake? She whispered, glancing around wildly. She had studied these phenomena, but the reality of being so close to potential danger set her on edge. Determined to regain some semblance of control, Emma reached for her seismometer, the tool she had meticulously packed. She needed data, she needed to understand what was happening. Her hands trembled slightly as she set it up, the anticipation of gathering valuable information overriding her fear. But as she adjusted the device, a sudden howl echoed through the trees, sharp and chilling. Emma froze, every instinct screaming for her to run back to her tent. "Is anyone there?" she called, her voice barely above a whisper, the tremor in her voice betraying her fear. The forest answered with silence, deeper and more foreboding than before. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, a frantic rhythm that matched the encroaching darkness. She thought of the stories she had heard, the local legends of spirits that roamed the woods, protecting the secrets of the earth. "Get a grip, Emma," she muttered to herself, shaking her head. "You're a scientist. You can't let folklore scare you." Yet, as she stood there, the night pressing in around her, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was not alone. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The air was thick with anticipation, and Emma's resolve began to waver. With the seismometer finally set up, she took a deep breath, focusing on the task at hand. She would document the seismic readings, no matter what. The thrill of discovery was still there, mingling with her fear. But as she stood in the darkness, the unknown stretching out before her, the forest whispered secrets she was not yet ready to hear. The ground beneath her trembled once more, and in that moment, Emma realized her adventure had only just begun. As Emma stepped outside her tent, the cool night air enveloped her, a stark contrast to the warmth of her sleeping bag. She took a deep breath, attempting to calm her racing heart. The world around her was cloaked in darkness, illuminated only by a sliver of moonlight breaking through the thick canopy of trees. The forest was alive with the sounds of nature. Crickets chirped, leaves rustled in a gentle breeze, and somewhere in the distance, a stream gurgled softly. Yet, beneath this symphony of nocturnal life, a strange tension hung in the air, palpable and unnerving. Suddenly, a tremor rippled through the ground beneath her feet, startling her. Emma stumbled slightly, her heart pounding as she steadied herself against the side of her tent. "What was that?" she whispered to herself, scanning the shadowy underbrush for any signs of movement. The tremor had felt almost like a heartbeat, a reminder that the earth was alive and unpredictable. She strained her ears, hoping to catch any sound that might explain the disturbance. "Just the wind," she muttered, though the tremor had felt distinctly different from a mere gust. The shadows of the trees loomed larger in the darkness, their gnarled branches stretching like skeletal fingers. Emma shook her head, trying to dispel the rising sense of dread. She had come out here to conduct research, to immerse herself in the beauty of geology and the wonders of the natural world. She wouldn't let fear undermine her dedication. But then, the ground shook again, more violently this time, and a deafening crack echoed through the forest. Emma's heart raced as she watched branches fall from nearby trees, crashing to the forest floor. The noise was terrifying, and panic began to grip her. "This can't be happening," she thought, her mind racing with possibilities. She had read about seismic activity, had studied fault lines in class, but experiencing it firsthand was an entirely different matter. "Okay, Emma, focus," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling slightly. She knew she had to gather data. This was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to study the seismic activity in real time. Adrenaline surged through her, pushing her into action. She quickly retrieved her seismometer from the tent, her hands shaking as she set it up on a flat patch of ground. The device beeped softly, its screen lighting up with data as she calibrated it. Just as she began to feel a sense of purpose, a chilling howl echoed through the trees, causing her blood to run cold. It was a sound unlike anything she had ever heard, deep, haunting, and primal. The howl reverberated through the forest, sending a shiver down her spine. Emma's heart raced as she spun around, half expecting to see a wild animal lurking in the shadows. "Is someone out there?" she called, her voice wavering. Silence fell, thick and suffocating. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to focus on the seismometer. "Get the readings, Emma. You can't let fear control you," she thought, but her mind kept drifting back to the eerie howl. Was she truly alone in this vast wilderness? She glanced around, the darkness seeming to close in around her, and once again, the ground trembled beneath her feet. "Ugh, come on," she exclaimed, frustration mixing with her fear. "Why now?" The seismometer beeped rhythmically, but the readings were erratic, fluctuating wildly. It was as if the earth itself was protesting her presence. She took a deep breath, attempting to steady her hands as she jotted down the data in her notebook. Suddenly, the howl returned, closer this time, sending a bolt of terror through her. "Okay, that's enough," she muttered. Emma grabbed the seismometer and started back toward her tent, her instincts screaming at her to seek safety. As she turned, another tremor struck, more powerful than the last. The ground shook violently, and Emma stumbled, barely catching herself against a tree. Branches cracked and snapped overhead, and she felt a surge of panic rise within her. "I need to get out of here," she thought, her pulse racing. But just as she was about to retreat to the safety of her tent, a voice pierced the darkness. "Hey, are you all right?" It was a deep, resonant voice, cutting through the chaos of her thoughts. Emma turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows, a silhouette framed by the moonlight. Relief washed over her, but it was quickly replaced with caution as she realized how close the figure was. Yes. I'm fine, she stammered, though she knew she sounded anything but confident. Just experiencing some seismic activity. The figure stepped closer, revealing a man dressed in a ranger's uniform. Seismic activity? This close to an active fault line? He shook his head, concern etching lines on his face. You shouldn't be out here alone, especially at night. It's dangerous. I know the risks, Emma replied defensively, crossing her arms. I'm here to gather data for my research. She gestured to the seismometer, her voice tinged with both pride and defiance. This is a unique opportunity to study the Earth's movements firsthand. The ranger studied her for a moment, his expression softening. I understand your passion, but you need to listen to me. The tremors you're feeling are not just the Earth shifting. They can lead to much more dangerous situations, especially if you're near a fault line. I've seen it happen before. Emma hesitated, the ranger's words weighing heavily on her. But I can't turn back now. I need to document this, she insisted, a mix of determination and fear in her voice. Your safety is more important than any data, he replied firmly. You're not just camping in the woods, you're on unstable ground. I can't stress enough how unpredictable this forest can be. Emma felt a flicker of doubt. What do you mean? What do you know about this area? The ranger took a deep breath, his gaze shifting toward the dark trees. There are legends about this place, stories passed down through generations. They say the forest is alive, that it guards its secrets fiercely. People have gone missing, and the Earth has a way of reclaiming what it considers its own. Legends? Emma scoffed, but her voice lacked conviction. I'm a geology student. I deal with facts and data, not folklore. Facts can only take you so far, he said, his tone serious. I've seen firsthand what happens when people ignore the signs. You hear those howls? It's not just the wind. The forest is warning you. Emma felt a chill creep up her spine, and for a moment, doubt flickered in her mind. But I can't just leave. What if something significant happens? What if I miss an opportunity to document it? The ranger stepped closer, his eyes locking onto hers. You have to weigh the risks. Data can always be collected later, but your safety is paramount. Think about it. You're alone out here, and the forest is unpredictable. As the ranger's words sunk in, Emma felt a mixture of frustration and fear. She didn't want to abandon her research, but the unease that had settled in her stomach was growing stronger. What should I do then? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Pack your things and come with me, he said, his voice softer now. I can take you to a safer area, and we can discuss your research in the morning when it's light. It's not too late. Emma hesitated, glancing back toward her tent, where the seismometer still blinked with data. But my equipment can be replaced, he interrupted gently. Your life cannot. Please, just trust me. After a moment of deliberation, Emma nodded, the weight of the ranger's concern settling in her heart. All right, she finally said, her voice steadying. Let's go. As she began to gather her belongings, the ground trembled once more, a reminder of the danger lurking beneath. Emma glanced back at the ranger, who watched her with a mixture of relief and concern. Let's move quickly, he urged, his voice low. Together, They hurried through the dark forest, the shadows shifting around them as the trees whispered secrets of their own. Emma felt a strange mix of emotions: fear, uncertainty, and an undeniable curiosity about the forest's hidden truths. As they walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was waiting for her beyond the reach of the trees, something that could change everything she thought she knew about the earth and her place within it. Emma woke the next morning to the soft light filtering through the thin fabric of her tent. The chirping of birds greeted her, a stark contrast to the tumultuous night she had just endured. The ground had trembled beneath her, the trees had whispered secrets, and a chilling howl had echoed through the darkness. As she unzipped the tent flap, the cool morning air filled her lungs, and for a moment, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. Yet, the memory of the seismic activity lingered in her mind like a storm cloud, casting a shadow over her thoughts. After stretching and shaking off the remnants of sleep, Emma stepped outside. The forest greeted her with its vibrant colors, the green leaves glistening with morning dew. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the scent of pine and earth. Her eyes darted around, searching for any signs of the previous night's chaos. The ground felt stable under her feet, but her heart raced as she recalled the tremors that had rattled her to the core. "Let's see what the seismometer has to say," she muttered to herself, her voice barely above a whisper. Emma hurried back inside her tent, where she had set up her equipment. The small device beeped softly, and she leaned closer, her heart pounding with anticipation. As she reviewed the data, her eyes widened. The readings were unusual, definitely more activity than she expected for this area. "Interesting," she whispered, jotting down notes in her journal. Despite the fear that had gripped her the night before, a spark of curiosity ignited within her. She was studying seismic activity, after all, and this could be an opportunity to document something significant. The thrill of discovery pushed her apprehensions aside, if only for a moment. After packing her gear, Emma decided to venture deeper into the forest. She followed a narrow path that wound through the trees, the sounds of nature enveloping her. The crunch of twigs underfoot and the rustle of leaves created a melody that soothed her nerves. As she walked, her mind raced with theories about the geological formations that might be nearby and how they could relate to the tremors she had experienced. It wasn't long before she stumbled upon a clearing. In the center lay a large, gnarled tree, its roots exposed as if it were trying to escape the earth that surrounded it. Emma approached, intrigued. As she circled the tree, something caught her eye, a glimmer of something wedged between the roots. She knelt down, brushing aside the dirt and leaves to reveal an old, weathered map. "Wow!" Emma exclaimed, her heart racing with excitement. The map was yellowed and frayed at the edges, but it was still legible. It depicted the surrounding area, highlighting various geological formations. She recognized some of the landmarks from her studies, but there were also markings she had never seen before. They hinted at a series of caves and rock formations that could potentially explain the seismic activity she was detecting. This could change everything, she thought, her mind racing with possibilities. She carefully folded the map and tucked it into her backpack, eager to explore the locations it pointed to. As she stood up, a sudden rustle in the bushes made her freeze. "Hello," she called out, her voice echoing in the stillness. There was no response, just the sound of leaves dancing in the wind. Emma's heart raced again, this time with a mix of excitement and trepidation. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the paranoia that clawed at her mind. After all, she was alone in the wilderness, and the forest was alive with the sounds of nature. Continuing on her path, Emma's thoughts returned to the map, If I can find those geological formations, I might be able to gather some concrete data, she mused aloud. The thrill of the scientific pursuit ignited her passion once again, pushing her fears to the back of her mind. As she ventured further, she suddenly caught sight of a figure walking along a nearby path. It was a park ranger, dressed in the typical green uniform, his hat tilted slightly forward, casting a shadow over his face. Emma felt a mix of relief and apprehension as she approached him. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice a bit louder than intended. The ranger turned, and she could see the weathered lines on his face, a testament to years spent in the wild. "Good morning," he replied, his voice deep and calm. "What brings you out here?" "I'm Emma," she introduced herself, extending a hand. "I'm a geology student, and I'm conducting research on seismic activity in this area. I just found this map that might lead to some significant geological formations." The ranger's eyes narrowed slightly as he examined her, perhaps gauging her sincerity. "This forest holds many secrets, Emma. What you're studying is not something to take lightly." "I understand," she said, her enthusiasm tempered by his serious tone. "But the readings I've gathered indicate unusual activity. I think there's something important here." The ranger nodded slowly, a frown creasing his brow. "There are dangers in these woods, especially near fault lines. You need to be cautious. Many have come here seeking knowledge, but not all have returned." Emma's heart sank at the undertone of warning in his words. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Legends speak of ancient spirits that guard these lands. They don't take kindly to those who disturb the earth," he explained, his gaze distant as if remembering something from long ago. "The tremors you felt last night may not just be geological. They can be a warning." "Are you saying there's more to this than just science?" she pressed, her curiosity piqued despite the chill running down her spine. "Sometimes the earth speaks in ways we don't understand," he replied cryptically. "Just be careful and heed the signs. The forest can be unforgiving." Emma nodded, absorbing his words. "I will. Thank you for the warning," she said, feeling a weight settle in her chest. The ranger stood still for a moment, studying her, before turning to walk away. "Wait," she called after him. "Could you tell me more about the local geology? I'd love to hear your insights." He paused, glancing back at her, a slight smile creeping onto his face. "There's a lot to learn if you're willing to listen. Follow me, I can show you some interesting formations nearby." With a mix of apprehension and excitement, Emma followed the ranger deeper into the forest. He led her along a narrow path, his steps sure and steady. As they walked, he pointed out various rock formations and explained their origins. Emma listened intently, jotting down notes as he spoke, her scientific mind racing with the implications of his words. "See that ridge over there?" he said, gesturing to a rocky outcrop bathed in sunlight. "That's an ancient fault line, one of the most active in this region. It has caused several quakes over the years." "Fascinating," she replied, her mind spinning with the information. "Do you think it's related to the readings I gathered?" "Possibly," he acknowledged. "But remember, the forest is unpredictable. The ground can shift without warning." Emma felt a knot tighten in her stomach, but she pressed on. "What about the legends you mentioned? Are they taken seriously here?" The ranger's expression turned somber. "Many of us respect the stories passed down through generations. The indigenous people believe that the spirits of the land protect it. disturbing that balance can have consequences. Consequences like the tremors, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Exactly, he said, stopping to face her. It's a delicate ecosystem, and we must be mindful of our presence. If you choose to stay, you'll need to be vigilant. Emma felt a mixture of determination and fear. I appreciate your guidance. I want to learn, but I also want to be safe. Good, the ranger replied, his eyes softening. Just remember, knowledge is power, but respect for the land is paramount. If you ever feel uneasy, trust your instincts. As they continued walking, Emma felt a growing sense of connection to the forest, but also a deep-seated unease. The ranger's warnings echoed in her mind, intertwining with her scientific curiosity. She was here to uncover the secrets of the earth, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she was treading on sacred ground. The two of them reached a small clearing, where the ground sloped gently down toward a stream. The water babbled softly, and the sunlight danced on its surface, creating a serene atmosphere. Emma took a moment to absorb the beauty around her, feeling a sense of peace despite the weight of the ranger's words. Here, the ranger said, pointing to a cluster of rocks by the water's edge. These formations are a result of erosion from the stream over time. They tell a story of the Earth's history. Emma knelt down, examining the rocks closely. She could see layers of sediment, each representing a different era. Incredible, she breathed, her fingers tracing the lines. It's like reading a book. Exactly, the ranger agreed, a twinkle in his eye. Just remember, some stories are better left untold. Emma looked up, meeting his gaze. I will keep that in mind. As they stood together in the quietude of the forest, Emma felt a sense of camaraderie with the ranger. He was not just a protector of the land, he was a guardian of its secrets. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Emma stood at the entrance of her tent, staring into the vastness of the Gifford Pinchot National Forest. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, a reminder of the recent rain that had swept through the area. She felt a mix of exhilaration and trepidation. The forest was alive with sounds that she had only read about in her geology textbooks. Despite the park ranger's warnings still echoing in her mind, Emma was resolute. Her ambition to uncover the geological mysteries hidden within these woods outweighed her growing unease. She had ventured here to observe seismic activity, and the tremors she had already experienced only fueled her determination. After all, knowledge was worth the risks, wasn't it? I'll just camp one more night, she murmured to herself, pulling her sleeping bag tighter around her shoulders. I can't leave now, not when I'm so close to discovering something significant. With a determined nod, she set about preparing her dinner. The crackling of the camp stove broke the stillness of the evening, and she focused on the task at hand, pushing aside the whispers of doubt that crept into her mind. Yet, as the shadows lengthened and the temperature dropped, a sense of foreboding settled over her like a heavy fog. Once her meal was prepared and consumed, Emma stowed her gear and settled into her tent. The sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, chirping crickets, and the distant call of an owl were oddly comforting, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. As dusk descended, an unsettling breeze swept through the trees, carrying with it whispers that seemed to dance just beyond her comprehension. Is anyone there? She called out into the darkness, her voice trembling slightly. The only response was the sound of the wind, swirling around her like a spectral presence. Emma's heart raced as she recalled the ranger's warnings about the forest's deep-rooted superstitions. He had spoken of spirits that lingered in the woods, guarding their secrets fiercely. She dismissed the thought this was science, not folklore. Yet, as she lay in her sleeping bag, the whispers grew louder, echoing in her ears, teasing her with half-formed words that felt both inviting and ominous. Then, without warning, the ground beneath her began to tremble once more. This time, it wasn't just a minor quaking, it was a violent shudder that rattled the very foundation of her tent. Emma shot upright, her heart pounding in her chest. The low rumble that accompanied the quake resonated from deep within the earth, a primal sound that sent shivers down her spine. "Not now, please, not again," she gasped, scrambling to unzip her tent. The shadows outside seemed to flicker and sway, as if alive, and Emma felt an overwhelming urge to flee. But the geologist in her fought against the instinct. She couldn't let fear dictate her actions. Pushing the tent flap aside, she stepped into the cool night air, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The forest was eerily quiet now, the usual sounds of wildlife abruptly silenced, as if the creatures of the night were holding their breath in anticipation. Emma's feet sank into the damp earth as she moved cautiously forward, her senses heightened. "Hello," she called again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is anyone there?" There was no reply, only the rustle of leaves as a sudden gust of wind swept through the trees, sending a shiver down her spine. Suddenly, the ground trembled again, and this time, the rumblings seemed to resonate from all around her, as if the very earth was growling in displeasure. Emma instinctively stumbled backward, her heart racing. The shadows around her flickered, twisting into shapes that played tricks on her mind. Was it the darkness, or were there figures moving in the periphery of her vision? "Get a grip, Emma," she muttered to herself, shaking her head as though to dispel the encroaching fear. "It's just the tremors, it's nothing more." But as she stood there, rooted to the spot, the whispers returned, clearer this time. They seemed to beckon her, curling around her like tendrils of smoke. "Emma, come closer, what do you want?" she shouted, frustration mingling with fear. The only response was the low rumble of the earth beneath her, a warning that felt urgent. Emma took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. The tremors were becoming unnervingly frequent, and the forest felt alive in a way she had never experienced before. What if the ranger had been right? What if there was something more to this place, something she was not meant to uncover? Pushing aside her apprehensions, she felt a pull towards the sound, a magnetic force drawing her deeper into the woods. Gripping her flashlight tighter, she moved forward, her pulse quickening with each step. The whispers grew louder, swirling around her like an ancient song, urging her on. As she ventured deeper, the trees loomed above her, gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The air felt heavier, charged with an energy she couldn't quite place. Emma's instincts screamed at her to turn back, but curiosity propelled her forward. She was a geologist, after all, driven by the pursuit of knowledge. Suddenly, the ground shook again, this time, a fierce tremor that sent Emma stumbling. She braced herself against a nearby tree, feeling its rough bark dig into her palm. The low rumble resonated once more, vibrating through her bones. It was as if the very earth was alive, trying to communicate with her. "Maybe I should have listened," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "What if I've gone too far?" Just then, a figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the beam of her flashlight. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she squinted to make out the face of a man clad in a ranger's uniform. His eyes were dark and serious, and there was an air of authority about him. "Emma," he said, his voice deep and resonant, cutting through the tension in the air. "You shouldn't be here." Startled, Emma took a step back, her heart racing. You're the ranger. I know what you thought, he interrupted, a hint of urgency in his voice. You think you can just camp here, ignore the warnings, and study the earth without consequences? But I'm here for research, she protested, trying to sound more confident than she felt. The seismic activity, there's something important happening here. The ranger shook his head. You're playing with forces you don't understand. This area has been unstable for decades, and the locals know better than to disturb what lies beneath. Emma felt a pang of frustration. But I've already experienced tremors. I can't just leave now. I need to gather more data. Data? Or disaster, he shot back, his eyes narrowing. You have no idea what you're meddling with. The earth is restless, and it doesn't take kindly to intruders. I'm not an intruder, Emma insisted, her voice rising. I'm a student. This is my field. I have to uncover the truth. Truth? What truth are you seeking? The ranger stepped closer, his expression softening slightly. Do you want to know what this forest holds? Do you want to understand its secrets? Because sometimes, ignorance is the safest path. Emma hesitated, the weight of his words hanging in the air. She glanced around, feeling the tremors beneath her feet intensify. The whispers seemed to grow louder, swirling around them like a tempest. I can't just walk away, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Not after everything I've gone through to get here. You think you're alone in this, the ranger replied, a hint of compassion threading through his tone. This forest has witnessed countless tragedies. The stories are woven into the very fabric of the land. What do you mean? Emma asked, her curiosity piqued despite her fear. The ranger hesitated, glancing back at the shadows that danced around them. There are tales of those who sought knowledge, only to awaken forces beyond their comprehension. The deeper you go, the more you risk losing everything. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. What are you saying? That I should just turn back? No, he said, his voice firm. I'm saying you need to understand what you're dealing with. You must tread carefully. The earth is not just rock and soil. It holds memories, and sometimes, those memories fight back. Suddenly, the ground trembled violently again, and a loud crack echoed through the trees. Emma stumbled, grabbing onto the ranger for support. The whispers crescendoed into a cacophony, drowning out her thoughts as shadows flickered ominously in the dim light. Stay close to me, the ranger commanded, pulling her toward the trees. We need to get to safety. Emma's heart raced as they moved deeper into the forest, the tremors increasing in frequency. She glanced back at her campsite, realizing the gravity of the situation. Whatever secrets the forest held, she was now entangled in them, and escaping would not be as simple as she had hoped. As they navigated through the trees, Emma felt a mixture of fear and exhilaration. The forest was alive, and Emma stood at the mouth of the cave, her heart racing as she peered into the darkness that seemed to swallow every hint of light. The air was charged, almost electric, and a deep rumble echoed from within, reverberating through the earth like a warning bell. She hesitated for a moment, the weight of her previous experiences pressing against her chest. The quakes had increased in frequency and intensity, a relentless reminder that she was treading on precarious ground. Yet, the scientist in her buzzed with anticipation, urging her forward. Just a few steps, she whispered to herself, clutching her flashlight tightly. You need to understand what's happening here. With determination, she stepped inside the cave, the cool air enveloping her like an embrace. The walls glistened with moisture, and as she walked deeper into the darkness, the sounds of the forest faded away, replaced by an ominous silence. Emma could feel the pulsing energy around her, almost as if the cave itself was alive, breathing in tandem with her own quickened heartbeat. As she ventured further, her flashlight beam danced across the rocky surfaces, illuminating strange markings that adorned the walls. They were etched with care, a series of spirals and lines that seemed to tell a story older than time itself. Emma's pulse quickened as she studied them, her mind racing to connect the dots. "What are you trying to say?" she murmured, kneeling before the markings. Her fingers traced the lines, feeling the grooves worn by centuries of time. It was as if the cave was a canvas, painted with the history of the Earth's violent past. Suddenly, another tremor shook the ground beneath her, more violent than before. The cave walls trembled, sending a shower of dust and small rocks cascading down from above. Emma's breath quickened, panic creeping in. She pushed herself up, her mind racing. She needed to document this, to understand the significance of what she had found. Okay, she said aloud, her voice echoing in the confined space. "Just gather your data, and then you can leave." She pulled out her notebook, quickly jotting down her observations about the cave and the markings. Each stroke of the pen felt like a lifeline, anchoring her to her purpose even as the ground quaked ominously beneath her. But the tremors grew stronger, and with each violent shake, the cave seemed to react. The air became thick with tension, and Emma felt a primal instinct urging her to flee. She shook her head, fighting against the rising tide of fear. "No, you can't let fear take over," she whispered, forcing herself to focus. "You're here for a reason." Just as she began to decipher one of the more intricate designs, a spiraling symbol that reminded her of a cyclone, the ground shook violently again, this time accompanied by a deep, resonant growl that seemed to come from the very heart of the earth. Emma stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest, and the cave responded with a low rumble, as if it were alive and aware of her presence. "Emma! Get out of here," she shouted to herself, though her feet felt rooted to the ground, caught in a web of curiosity and fear. The markings seemed to pulse with energy, almost as if they were calling her to stay. But the instinct to survive was stronger. She turned to make her way back, but before she could take a step, the ground trembled yet again, accompanied by a sharp crack that sent ice-cold fear coursing through her. Dust filled the air, and small rocks began to fall from the ceiling. Emma's heart raced as she realized the cave was beginning to collapse. "Not now! Please," she cried, her voice rising in panic. She darted towards the entrance, the darkness behind her swarming with threatening shadows. The tremors intensified, and Emma could feel the cave's walls closing in, the earth groaning as if it were in pain. Just a little further, she urged herself, pushing through the thickening dust and debris. The flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light that danced across the walls, illuminating her path just enough to keep her moving forward. "Come on, Emma! You can do this," she shouted, her voice strained with fear and determination. Just as she neared the exit, the ground shook violently again, and a massive rock fell from above, narrowly missing her as she ducked to the side. The cave was alive with sound now, an orchestra of rumbling, cracking, and the distant echo of her own heart pounding in her ears. "Please, please," she begged the universe, her breath coming in quick gasps. She could see the light at the mouth of the cave, but it felt impossibly far away, the darkness behind her closing in like a predator. With one last surge of adrenaline, Emma sprinted towards the exit, her legs moving almost on instinct. The cave groaned around her, and she could feel the ground shifting beneath her. She reached the threshold, the light spilling over her like a warm embrace, but just as she was about to step into freedom, the ground shook violently one last time. Emma stumbled, her foot catching on a rock, and she fell to the ground just outside the cave. The earth trembled beneath her, and she rolled away instinctively, gasping for breath as she watched the entrance to the cave collapse in on itself, stones and dirt spilling down like a waterfall. Hoa, she breathed heavily, her heart racing as she lay on the ground, covered in dust and shaking from the adrenaline. The world around her was eerily quiet now, the echoes of the quake fading into the distance as she struggled to comprehend what had just happened. As she pushed herself up, brushing the dirt from her clothes, Emma's eyes widened in disbelief. Standing at the entrance of the cave, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, was a figure she recognized, the park ranger she had encountered earlier. "Emma," he called, his voice steady and calm against the chaos that had just unfolded. "You shouldn't have been in there." I know. Emma stammered, her voice trembling. "I needed to understand what was happening. The markings tell stories of the past," the ranger interrupted, stepping closer. "Stories that warn us of the forces that lie beneath the earth. You've disturbed something you don't understand." Emma felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" He looked at her intently, his eyes reflecting an ancient wisdom. "This forest is alive with the history of seismic activity. The spirits of those who have come before us protect this land, and when disturbed, they can awaken." "Spirits?" Emma echoed, incredulity lacing her voice, though a part of her couldn't dismiss the peculiar energy she had felt inside the cave. "You can't be serious." "I am very serious," he replied, his voice low and firm. "The earth remembers, Emma. It remembers the destruction, the cataclysms. You may have awakened something that could change everything." Emma's heart raced as she processed his words. The notion of spirits guarding the forest seemed absurd, yet the tremors, the cave's collapse, and the markings all pointed to a reality she had never considered. "What do I do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now," he said, "you need to leave this place. Return to the world you know, and share your experience. The knowledge you seek is important, but it's not worth your life." Emma nodded slowly, a wave of understanding washing over her. The forest held secrets far beyond her comprehension, and her quest for knowledge had led her to the brink of disaster. As she turned to leave, the ranger placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Remember, Emma," he said softly, "the earth is not just a subject for study. It's a living entity, deserving of respect. You have a responsibility now." "I will," she promised, her voice steadying. "I'll do everything I can to share what I've learned." With one last glance at the cave that had nearly become her tomb, Emma walked away from the shadows of the forest, the weight of her experience heavy on her shoulders but also igniting a new purpose within her. She had ventured into the unknown and returned with a greater understanding, not just of geology, but of the delicate balance between humanity and the earth. As she made her way back to her campsite, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Emma could feel the presence of the ancient spirits surrounding her, whispering secrets only she could hear. She was no longer just a student of geology, she was now a storyteller, a guardian of the knowledge that could change the future of the forest and those who dared to explore it. As the tremors subsided momentarily, Emma found herself enveloped in a suffocating silence, her heart still racing from the chaos that had just unfolded. The cave, once a promising site for geological exploration, now felt like a tomb. Dust hung in the air, illuminated by the faint light that filtered through the entrance, creating an ethereal glow that danced around her. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the rising panic within her, but the oppressive atmosphere weighed heavily on her chest. "Think, Emma. You can't just sit here," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible above the faint echoes of the cave's groaning walls. Her mind raced back to the ranger's warning, the stories of ancient spirits that protected the forest. Had she truly disturbed something? Was it mere superstition, or was there a deeper truth lurking within the shadows of Gifford Pinchot National Forest? The ground trembled again, this time more violently, and she could hear the sound of rocks shifting above her. Panic surged through her veins, and she instinctively began to move toward the exit. Each step felt perilous as she navigated the jagged terrain, her instincts screaming at her to escape. She reached for the wall, feeling the cool, damp stone beneath her fingers, guiding her through the darkness. Come on, she urged herself, her breath coming in quick gasps. The sound of falling debris echoed behind her, spurring her onward. Just as she thought she might have a moment to collect her thoughts, the tremors intensified, and a loud crack reverberated through the cave. Emma's heart dropped. She needed to get out before the cave collapsed entirely. As she approached the exit, the light grew brighter, illuminating her path. She felt a strange sensation, as if the air itself was charged with energy. It was exhilarating yet terrifying, a reminder of the power of nature that she had come to study. But this was a force she had not anticipated, something primal and ancient. She stumbled as the ground shook beneath her, and with a final push, she lunged toward the opening. Emerging from the cave, she was greeted by the cool, crisp air of the forest. The sunlight dazzled her eyes, and for a moment, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. But that relief was short-lived. Standing at the cave's entrance was the park ranger, his figure ghostly against the backdrop of towering trees. His expression was grave, yet there was a familiarity in his eyes that sent shivers down her spine. "Emma," he spoke, his voice steady and deep, as if the forest itself had given him strength. "You've awakened something that should have remained undisturbed. I warned you about the fault lines and the spirits that guard this land." Emma blinked, unable to fully comprehend the reality of the moment. I didn't mean to. I was just trying to learn, to gather data." Her voice trembled as she struggled to articulate her intentions. "I thought I could handle it." The ranger stepped closer, his presence both reassuring and intimidating. Handling the forces of nature requires respect, not just knowledge. You're not just a student of geology, you're standing on sacred ground. Those markings you found, they tell a story of destruction, of a time when the earth shook and the spirits of the forest were angered. Emma felt a chill crawl down her spine as his words sank in. "But I thought they were just legends, stories to scare campers away," she replied, her voice faltering. "I didn't believe. I was naive. I wanted to uncover the truth." "Truth is often more complex than we can fathom," the ranger replied, his gaze piercing through her. "You've stumbled into a realm where scientific inquiry and ancient beliefs intertwine. The vibrations you felt were not merely the tremors of the earth, they were warnings, an echo of the past." Emma's mind raced as she tried to reconcile her scientific training with the mystical implications of his words. "Are you saying the spirits are real?" "That they, guardians," he interrupted, his tone softening slightly. "They protect the balance of this forest. You've disturbed it, and now you must understand the consequences of your actions. Your research could help others avoid the same fate, but first, you need to learn to respect the land. But how? I'm just one person, she said, frustration bubbling to the surface. I didn't intend to cause harm. I thought I was helping. The ranger studied her for a moment, the tension in the air palpable. You have a choice, Emma. You can leave now, return to your life and forget this encounter. Or you can stay and learn. The forest has wisdom to share, but it will demand your respect and your commitment. Emma hesitated, her heart torn between the thrill of discovery and the fear of what she had awakened. What if I stay? What if I'm not strong enough to understand? Strength comes from understanding, he replied, his voice calm and steady. You have the passion and drive. You only need to align that with humility and respect for the forces you're dealing with. She took a deep breath, looking back at the cave that had held her captive moments before. I want to learn. I want to understand what I've stumbled into. But it's terrifying. Fear is a natural response, he said, a hint of a smile ghosting across his lips. But remember, you're not alone. The forest has its own rhythm, its own life. Embrace it, and you'll discover its secrets. Emma felt a spark of resolve ignite within her. The path she had chosen was fraught with challenges, but perhaps it was also filled with opportunities for growth. Okay, she said, her voice steadying. I'll stay. Good, the ranger nodded, a look of approval crossing his features. We'll begin by understanding the land around us. I'll show you the places where the earth speaks most clearly. But first, we need to ensure that you're safe. The tremors may return, and we must be prepared. As he led her deeper into the forest, Emma felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. The trees loomed overhead, their branches swaying gently in the breeze, whispering secrets that she longed to uncover. The ranger moved with purpose, his familiarity with the terrain evident in every step. Tell me more about the spirits, she urged, her curiosity getting the better of her. What do they represent? Why are they so protective? The spirits are the embodiment of the land's history, he explained, glancing back at her as they walked. They are the guardians of balance and harmony. When the earth is disturbed, they react to protect their home. The cave you entered is sacred, a place where the past and present converge. It's a reminder of the power that lies beneath our feet. Emma nodded, absorbing his words. And the markings inside? What do they mean? They tell stories of past earthquakes, of communities that thrived and fell in the wake of nature's fury, he replied. Each mark is a testament to resilience and a warning to those who seek to exploit the land. Together, they traversed the forest, the ranger sharing tales of the land's history while Emma listened intently. With each step, her fear began to dissipate, replaced by a growing sense of purpose. She had entered the forest seeking knowledge, but now she was beginning to understand the deeper connections between geology, history, and the spirits that dwelled within. As they reached a clearing, the ranger paused, turning to face her. This is a place where the earth speaks loudest, he said, gesturing to the ground beneath their feet. Listen closely. Emma closed her eyes, focusing on the sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird, and then, faintly, the low hum of the earth. It resonated within her, a heartbeat that echoed the rhythm of the forest. In that moment, she felt an overwhelming sense of belonging, as if she were part of something much larger than herself. I understand now, she whispered, her voice filled with awe. This place is alive. The ranger smiled, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. "You're beginning to see the truth, Emma. Now, let's continue our journey. There's much more to discover, and the forest is waiting for you to embrace its secrets." With renewed determination, Emma followed the ranger deeper into the heart of the forest, ready to unravel the mysteries that lay ahead. The tremors she had once feared now felt like the pulse of the land, guiding her toward a future intertwined with the very essence of the earth itself. As the sun began its descent behind the towering pines of the Monongahela National Forest, Jake felt a familiar thrill course through him. He had always been drawn to the wilderness, but now, as a rookie ranger, the forest felt like his second home. The air was crisp, and a scent of damp earth and pine needles filled his lungs. With his patrol gear strapped on, he took a moment to appreciate the vibrant hues of the dusk sky, the orange and purple blending together like a masterful painting. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he muttered to himself, a smile creeping across his face. The quiet rustle of leaves and the distant sound of a stream were the music of nature, a symphony that eased his mind. He took a deep breath, inhaling the serenity that surrounded him, and began his rounds. As he walked along the narrow path, he marveled at the towering trees that stood like ancient guardians of the forest. Each step he took crunched softly underfoot, the sounds of nature enveloping him in a comforting embrace. He often thought of the stories he had heard about the forest, the legends of lost hikers, strange creatures lurking in the shadows, and the beauty that hid a darker truth. But tonight, those tales felt distant, and he focused on the task at hand. Suddenly, a rustle in the bushes interrupted his thoughts. Jake halted, his heart racing slightly as he turned his head towards the source of the sound. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing softly in the twilight. There was no response, just the distant chirping of crickets and the whisper of the wind through the trees. He shook his head, dismissing it as a small animal, a rabbit or a deer, perhaps. Continuing his patrol, Jake found himself drawn to a cluster of trees that had always intrigued him. The underbrush was thick, and he had often imagined the secrets it could hold. As he approached, he caught a glimpse of something darting behind one of the larger trees. It was fleeting, a shadow moving quickly, but it sent a shiver down his spine. Just a deer, he reassured himself, though the unease settled in the pit of his stomach. The forest was alive, after all, and the thought of being alone in such an expansive wilderness was both exhilarating and disconcerting. He stepped closer to the tree, scanning the area for any sign of movement. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, playing tricks on his eyes. "Maybe I should just head back," he whispered, feeling a prick of anxiety gnawing at him. But before he could turn away, he caught sight of something unusual, a piece of fabric snagged on a low-hanging branch. It shimmered slightly in the fading light, an unnatural hue that contrasted sharply with the browns and greens of the forest. Curiosity piqued, he stepped closer to investigate. Jake reached up and tugged gently at the fabric, pulling it free from the branch. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, a high-tech camouflage material, its surface reflecting the dim light in a way that made it almost invisible against the foliage. His heart raced. Who would leave something like this behind in the forest? He held the fabric up to the light, inspecting it closely. "What the hell?" he murmured, a sense of unease creeping back over him. He turned it over in his hands, noticing the intricate stitching and the faint scent of something metallic. It was clear this was no ordinary piece of clothing. It was designed for concealment, for stealth. Just then, a distant sound caught his attention, an echoing whisper that seemed to weave through the trees. Jake froze, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. He strained to listen, but the whispers faded as quickly as they had come, leaving only the rustle of leaves in their wake. He felt a chill run down his spine, a primal instinct urging him to flee. "Get a grip, Jake," he muttered, shaking his head as if to dispel the unsettling feeling. "It's just your imagination." But he couldn't shake the sensation of being watched, the feeling that eyes were upon him, hidden in the shadows. The forest had always felt like a friend, but tonight, it felt different, hostile, almost. With the strange fabric still in hand, he decided it was time to head back to the ranger station. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and darkness began to envelop the forest. Shadows danced between the trees, and the familiar paths felt foreign and ominous. He quickened his pace, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the silence, each crunch of leaves amplifying the feeling of isolation. As he navigated the trail, the whispers returned, more insistent this time, swirling around him like a dark cloud. His heart raced, pounding in his chest as he glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, lurking behind him. The fabric felt heavy in his pocket, a constant reminder of the mystery he had stumbled upon. "Focus," he whispered to himself, forcing his mind to clear. "You're a ranger. You can handle this." But even as he recited the mantra, doubt gnawed at him. What if the whispers were real? What if someone, or something, was indeed watching him? He stumbled slightly on a root, catching himself before he could fall. "Just the forest," he said, trying to convince himself, but the words felt hollow. He could almost hear the laughter of unseen figures, mocking him for his growing fear. The shadows seemed to shift, coiling around him like a serpent ready to strike. As he emerged from the dense underbrush, he found himself in a small clearing bathed in the dim light of the moon. He paused, taking a deep breath to steady himself. The clearing felt serene, illuminated by the soft glow of the moonlight filtering through the trees. For a brief moment, he could almost forget the dread that had been creeping up on him. But just as he began to relax, a loud snap echoed from behind him, a branch breaking underfoot. Jake's pulse quickened as he turned abruptly, scanning the darkness for the source of the sound. "Hello," he called out again, his voice trembling slightly. Silence swallowed his words, and the only response was the rustling of leaves in the cool night air. He took a tentative step back, his instincts screaming at him to run. The forest, once a sanctuary, now felt like a labyrinth of terrors waiting to ensnare him. Every shadow seemed to shift, and every whisper echoed with a sense of foreboding. He felt the weight of the darkness pressing down on him, suffocating and oppressive. "Just the wind," he muttered, attempting to reassure himself, but the doubt lingered in the back of his mind. He turned to continue his path, but as he did, he caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of his eye, a fleeting shadow darting between the trees. His breath hitched in his throat, and he felt the primal urge to flee. But curiosity held him in place. "What are you?" he whispered, squinting into the darkness. As he took a step towards the shadows, a sudden chill swept through the clearing, causing him to shudder. It was as if the forest itself was warning him to stay away. With a deep breath, he turned on his heel, hastening his return to the ranger station. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer alone in the forest, that something was lurking just beyond his sight, waiting for him to let his guard down. As he reached the edge of the clearing, the fabric in his pocket tugged at him, a reminder of the enigma he had uncovered. He glanced back, half expecting to see someone watching him, but there was only darkness, an endless void that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Jake slowed his pace, glancing over his shoulder one last time before disappearing into the trees. The whispers faded into the night, but the feeling of being watched lingered, a haunting reminder of the mysteries that lay hidden within the depths of the Monongahela National Forest. Little did he know, this was just the beginning of a terrifying journey that would shake the very foundation of his understanding of the wilderness and himself. Under the thick canopy of the Monongahela National Forest, the air felt electric with anticipation. Jake adjusted the straps of his backpack, his flashlight cutting through the gathering darkness like a knife. Determined to uncover the source of the unsettling disturbances he had experienced the previous night, he ventured deeper into the woods, his senses heightened. Each rustle of leaves and distant snap of a twig made his heart race, reminding him of the lurking shadows that had sent shivers down his spine. With every step, Jake was acutely aware of the cool evening air brushing against his skin, and he could almost taste the damp earth beneath his boots. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was not alone, a sensation that clawed at the edges of his mind. The forest, which had initially captivated him with its serene beauty, now seemed to be holding its breath, watching him. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the rising tide of anxiety. "Just the wind," he murmured to himself, though his voice sounded small against the overwhelming silence. As he moved further into the woods, Jake's flashlight beam swept over the trees, illuminating patches of underbrush that seemed to writhe with shadows. He paused, squinting into the darkness, convinced he had seen something shift just beyond the reach of his light. "Come on, Jake," he whispered, shaking his head. "It's just your imagination." But the unease settled deeper within him, gnawing at his resolve. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Jake caught a glimpse of movement, a flicker of a silhouette darting behind a sturdy oak. His breath hitched as he instinctively crouched low, his heart pounding in his chest. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing eerily in the stillness. Silence enveloped him in response, thick and suffocating, pressing against his ears. He strained to listen, but all he heard was the sound of his own heartbeat, rapid and frantic. Summoning his courage, Jake crept toward the tree where he had seen the shadow. The forest floor was littered with dry leaves, which crunched underfoot, betraying his presence. He paused, holding his breath, and peered around the oak. Nothing. Just the quiet rustle of leaves and the distant calls of nocturnal creatures. He felt a chill run down his spine, the kind that spoke of something hidden, something watching. With his senses on high alert, Jake continued his patrol, the beam of his flashlight flickering nervously over the underbrush. Suddenly, a soft rustling erupted from a nearby thicket. He froze, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. "Is anyone there?" he called out again, his voice stronger this time, but still laced with uncertainty. There was no reply, only the sound of the wind weaving through the trees. Jake took a cautious step forward, his flashlight illuminating the area around him. Just then, a flash of movement caught his eye, a figure slipping silently between the trees, their outline barely discernible against the darkened backdrop of the forest. Panic surged through him, and he instinctively followed, heart racing as adrenaline coursed through his veins. "Hey! Stop!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the night, but the figure vanished into the shadows as if it had never existed. Frustrated but undeterred, Jake pressed on, determined to uncover the mystery that had begun to haunt him. As he navigated through the thick underbrush, he stumbled upon a small clearing, the ground littered with debris. His flashlight beam fell across an unusual sight, a hidden campsite, partially concealed by branches and overgrown shrubs. The sight sent a jolt of unease through him. He approached cautiously, scanning the area. tattered tents were pitched haphazardly, and the ground was strewn with an array of hunting gear, camouflaged clothing, high-tech gadgets, and discarded food wrappers that spoke of recent activity. A sense of dread washed over him as he realized he had stumbled upon something sinister. This was no ordinary campsite, it was a poacher's den. Jake crouched low, his breath steady despite the rising panic. He rifled through the gear, his fingers trembling with adrenaline. High-tech equipment and strange devices littered the area, each one a testament to the illegal activities taking place within the forest. He could hardly believe what he was seeing. "What the hell is going on here?" he muttered under his breath, his mind racing with the implications. He heard a faint noise, voices, low and conspiratorial, drifting through the trees. Jake froze, his instincts screaming at him to hide. He ducked behind a nearby tree, his heart pounding as he strained to listen. The voices grew clearer, and he caught snippets of conversation. "We can't let him get in our way," one voice hissed, filled with malice. Jake's heart sank as fear gripped him. He had to report this, he needed backup. But as he turned to leave the campsite, an icy breath ghosted across the back of his neck, freezing him in place. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes upon him, and a chill crept down his spine. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice barely above a whisper. Silence hung in the air, thick and suffocating. He felt the urge to run, to escape the forest that felt suddenly hostile and alive with danger. But his legs wouldn't move, he was rooted to the spot, a primal instinct warning him of the peril that lay ahead. He could hear the faint rustle of leaves, the echo of footsteps drawing closer. "Jake," a voice broke through the stillness, low and menacing. "You shouldn't be here." Jake's breath caught in his throat. He turned slowly, his flashlight beam trembling as it swept across the clearing. There, emerging from the darkness, were three figures clad in advanced camouflage, their faces obscured. They moved with an unsettling fluidity, blending seamlessly with their surroundings. Panic surged through Jake, his instincts screaming for him to flee. "Run, Jake," he thought, but his body betrayed him, frozen by fear. The figures stepped closer, their intentions clear in their predatory movements. "What do you want?" he managed to croak, trying to project confidence despite the terror that gripped him. "Just a little chat," one of them replied, a cruel grin breaking through the shadows. "You've been poking your nose where it doesn't belong, Ranger." Jake's mind raced, contemplating his options. He needed to escape, to get to safety and alert the authorities. But as he considered his next move, a sense of hopelessness washed over him. The forest, once a place of beauty and tranquility, had transformed into a dark maze, filled with threats and unseen horrors. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as he took a small step back, preparing to turn and run. But he was met with a sudden crash of leaves behind him, and as he whirled around, he was met with the same unsettling darkness that had haunted him since his first night patrol. The figures had vanished, leaving only the echo of their laughter hanging in the air like a sinister promise. Jake stumbled back into the underbrush, his breath coming in short gasps. He had to report this, he had to warn someone. But as he turned toward the path that led back to his vehicle, he felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle in his chest. The forest had become a living thing, pulsating with secrets and dangers, and he was just a lone ranger, a novice in a world far more complicated than he had ever imagined. "Get it together, Jake," he muttered, shaking his head to dispel the panic. "You're a ranger. You can handle this." With determination stealing his resolve, he stepped forward, ready to confront the darkness that had begun to seep into his very soul. The forest might be filled with shadows, but he was not going to let them claim him. As he made his way back, the rustling leaves whispered warnings in the darkness, and the shadows danced just out of reach. But Jake pressed on, his flashlight illuminating the path ahead, a beacon of hope against the encroaching night. The sense of being watched lingered, but he refused to let it paralyze him. He would find a way through this, even if he had to face the darkness head-on. Jake sat on the edge of his bed in the small ranger station, his fingers tapping nervously on the worn wooden surface. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the shadows outside his window lengthened ominously. He stared at his radio, willing it to come to life, and filled with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The discoveries he had made in the forest swirled in his mind like a storm, clamoring for his attention. He took a deep breath and picked up the radio. "Sheriff Colin, this is Ranger Jake," he said, his voice barely steady. "I need to report something urgent." There was a crackle on the other end, followed by the sheriff's familiar, somewhat gravelly voice. "What's going on, Jake?" "It's late." Jake hesitated, wondering if he should share the details. He could already feel the skepticism radiating from the sheriff, a man he respected but who had a reputation for dismissing the oddities of the woods as mere figments of imagination. "I've found a hidden campsite in the woods. It's filled with high-tech gear. I think there are poachers operating in the area." There was a long silence, and Jake could almost hear the sheriff's thoughts racing. Finally, Colin spoke, his tone laced with disbelief. "Jake, it's probably just some hikers who got lost. The forest plays tricks on the mind at night. You're new to this, remember? Just stick to the basics and keep your head down." Frustration bubbled in Jake's chest. "Sheriff, I'm not imagining things. I saw shadows moving, and I found easy there, rookie. Just take a breath. I'll send someone out in the morning to check the area, but I wouldn't worry too much about it. Just keep patrolling, all right?" The radio clicked off, leaving Jake in a silence that felt heavier than before. He felt a deep sense of isolation, like the trees outside were closing in on him, their dark silhouettes a reminder of the secrets they held. With his heart racing, he glanced at the clock. Time was slipping away, and he knew he had to act. If he couldn't convince the sheriff, he would have to take matters into his own hands. Grabbing his flashlight and radio, Jake slipped quietly out of the station and into the cool night air. The forest loomed around him, a labyrinth of shadows and whispers. Each step felt like a journey deeper into a realm where reality blurred with something far more sinister. He crouched low in the underbrush, heart pounding, as he ventured toward the campsite he had discovered. The moon cast a silvery glow over the forest floor, illuminating patches of wildflowers and the twisted roots of ancient trees. Jake's senses were heightened, each sound amplified in the stillness, an owl hooting in the distance, the rustle of leaves, the soft scurry of a creature hidden in the undergrowth. He felt the weight of the darkness pressing against him, but he forged ahead, fueled by determination and a growing sense of trepidation. As he approached the campsite, he could feel the tension in the air thickening. The remnants of a fire pit were visible through the underbrush, and the smell of charred wood lingered. He moved cautiously, scanning the area for any signs of life or activity. The high-tech equipment he had seen earlier was still scattered around, a stark contrast to the raw, untouched wilderness surrounding it. Suddenly, the snap of a twig echoed behind him. Jake whirled around, flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. His heart raced as he focused on the shadows, his breath quickening. A figure emerged briefly from the trees, shrouded in darkness, a grin stretching across its face before it melted back into the night. "Show yourself," Jake called out, his voice trembling as he gripped the flashlight tighter. Silence enveloped him, amplifying the sound of his own heartbeat. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the very essence of the forest was holding its breath, waiting for him to make a move. Each moment stretched into eternity, the shadows becoming darker and more foreboding. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice firmer this time, though doubt crept into his thoughts. Was he losing his mind? Had the solitude of the night driven him to paranoia? Just as he was about to turn back, he heard a low chuckle, a sound that sent chills down his spine. "Rookie Ranger," a voice taunted from the darkness. "What do you think you're doing here?" Jake felt a surge of adrenaline. "I'm here to protect this forest, and I know you're poaching." The laughter continued, mocking and sinister. "Protect? You're just a kid playing at being a hero. You have no idea what you're dealing with." Jake's instincts kicked in. He had to be smart. Confrontation could end badly. He took a step back, scanning the thick underbrush for a way out, but the shadows seemed to close in around him, trapping him in a web of fear. "I'm not afraid of you," he said, though he could feel the tremor in his voice. "Really?" The voice came again, closer this time. "Then why are you shaking?" Just as Jake was about to respond, another crack of a twig echoed nearby, causing him to spin around again. This time, he could see faint outlines moving among the trees, silhouettes shifting and blending into the darkness. Panic surged through him. He had stumbled into something far more dangerous than he had anticipated. In a split second, Jake made his decision. He had to gather evidence to prove to the sheriff that he wasn't just chasing shadows. He crouched low, keeping himself hidden among the underbrush as he fumbled for his radio. "Sheriff Colin, can you hear me?" he whispered urgently, praying for a response. Static buzzed back, and frustration bubbled within him. He should have known better than to rely on the radio when he was so deep in the woods. With the shadows closing in, he decided he had to act quickly. He pulled out his phone, hoping to capture some footage of the campsite, but as he pointed the camera toward the dark figures, he felt a cold shiver run down his spine. "Time to go, rookie," the voice hissed from behind him. Jake spun around, heart racing as he faced the shadowy figure once more. It was grinning, eyes glinting with malice, before it vanished into the trees. Jake took a deep breath, fighting the rising tide of fear. He needed to confront this darkness head-on. He had to protect the forest, not just from the poachers but from the demons that lurked within his own mind. With a resolve that surprised even himself, he stepped forward, determined to face whatever lay ahead. Pushing through the underbrush, Jake felt the weight of the forest pressing down on him, its secrets beckoning him deeper into the night. He could hear the faint sounds of laughter in the distance, the poachers reveling in their illicit activities. He was terrified, but he was also fueled by a sense of purpose. This was his chance to uncover the truth, to stand against the darkness that threatened the sanctuary he had come to cherish. "Hey! I know you're out there," he shouted into the void, challenging the shadows to respond. The forest held its breath, and for a moment, silence reigned. But then he heard it again, the soft crunch of leaves, the unmistakable sound of movement. They were close. His heart raced as he felt the adrenaline surge through him. He was teetering on the edge of fear and courage, a fine line that could easily tip in either direction. In that moment, he understood that the forest was not just a place of beauty, it was also a battleground, and he was determined to fight for it. As the laughter grew louder, Jake steeled himself for what was to come. He had come too far to turn back now. With his flashlight in hand and his heart pounding, he prepared to confront the darkness head-on, ready to face whatever horror awaited him in the depths of Monongahela National Forest. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a silvery glow across the dense foliage of the Monongahela National Forest. Jake crouched low behind a gnarled root, his heart racing as he adjusted the focus on his hidden camera. The small device blinked a soft red light, its lens aimed directly at the makeshift campsite he had stumbled upon the previous night. He could feel the cool breeze against his skin, mingling with the anxiety swirling in his gut. Tonight was the night he would gather proof of the poachers, and hopefully, put an end to their illicit activities. Jake glanced at his watch, the second hand ticking away the moments until he would either catch the poachers in the act or find himself in a perilous situation once again. He had spent the day preparing, poring over maps and scouting the area, all the while contemplating the shadows that had haunted him since his first unsettling encounter. The forest, once a sanctuary, now felt like a living entity, watching and waiting, its secrets hidden just out of reach. "Just keep it together," he whispered to himself, shaking off the creeping dread that slithered into his thoughts. "This is for the forest." The monitor flickered, and Jake's heart jumped as he saw movement on the screen. Shadows began to coalesce at the edge of the trees, figures emerging like specters from the darkness. They wore suits that shimmered and shifted, blending seamlessly with the surroundings, an unnerving combination of technology and stealth. The sight sent a chill down his spine. They were exactly what he had feared. Jake leaned forward, squinting at the screen, his breath shallow as he tried to discern their intentions. The figures moved cautiously, their bodies low and purposeful, as if they were predators stalking their prey. He couldn't make out their faces, but the air was thick with their malice, an oppressive presence that seemed to weigh down on him. "Come on, just a little closer," he muttered, his fingers itching to reach for his radio. He needed to call for backup, but he knew that any sudden movement could alert the poachers. Patience was key, but as the seconds dragged on, the urgency of the situation gnawed at him. Suddenly, Jake felt a jolt of adrenaline. One of the figures turned slightly, revealing a dark mask that obscured their features. The glint of a weapon caught the moonlight, and Jake's instincts kicked in. He couldn't sit idly by any longer. He had to confront them. As he prepared to step from his hiding place, his foot caught on a twisted root, sending him sprawling forward into a pile of leaves. The sound of rustling foliage echoed through the stillness, and he froze. The poachers had heard him. "Did you hear that?" one of the figures said, their voice low and menacing. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, the taste of adrenaline flooding his mouth. "Yeah, it came from over there," another voice replied, sharp and alert. "Check it out." Jake scrambled to his feet, panic coursing through his veins as the figures began to move in his direction. He had to think fast. He darted behind a nearby tree, pressing his back against the rough bark, his breath coming in quick, ragged gasps. He could hear their footsteps crunching on the leaves, each sound amplifying his sense of impending doom. "They must be hiding," one of them said, a slight edge of excitement in their tone. "Let's flush them out." Jake gritted his teeth, his mind racing as he considered his options. He could call for help, but the radio was sitting uncomfortably in his pocket, and he didn't want to risk alerting them to his exact location. Instead, he focused on the path behind him, where the dense brush could provide him with a potential escape route. "Spread out," a third voice commanded. "We'll find them." As he peered around the tree, Jake caught sight of the figures splitting up, scanning the area with predatory precision. The sight of them, cloaked in their advanced camouflage, made his stomach churn. They were not just poachers, they were hunters, and he was their prey. A bead of sweat trickled down his forehead as he weighed his options. He could make a run for it, the underbrush would provide cover. But the thought of sprinting into the dark forest, filled with unseen dangers, paralyzed him. He was a rookie ranger, trained to protect, yet here he was, cornered by those who had no respect for the laws he had vowed to uphold. "Where are you hiding?" one of the poachers shouted, the taunt echoing through the trees. "You can't run forever." Jake's heart raced. He had to act. Taking a deep breath, he pushed himself off the tree and sprinted toward the thicket behind him. The moment he broke into the open, he heard a shout behind him. "There! Over there!" The sound of their footsteps grew louder, the thrill of the hunt evident in their voices. Jake dashed through the underbrush, branches whipping against his skin, pain igniting with each collision. He could feel the fear surging within him, urging him to move faster, to escape the clutches of these ruthless hunters. "Get him!" one of the poachers yelled, their voice filled with exhilaration. "Don't let him get away." He could hear them closing in, the sound of their pursuit echoing in his ears. Panic surged through him, and he glanced over his shoulder, catching a fleeting glimpse of the figures, their eyes glinting with malice beneath their masks. They were determined, relentless, and he was nothing more than a fleeting shadow in their sights. "Please, I just want to protect this forest," he shouted, desperation lacing his voice. But his pleas fell on deaf ears. As he plunged deeper into the darkness, he felt the ground give way beneath him. He stumbled, losing his footing as he tumbled into a concealed pit, leaves and dirt collapsing around him. The world above disappeared in a flurry of chaos, the sounds of the forest muffled as he landed with a thud at the bottom. Dazed, Jake struggled to regain his bearings, the cold earth pressing against his back. He glanced up, his heart sinking as he realized he was trapped. The poachers were above him, their figures silhouetted against the moonlight, laughing at his misfortune. "Looks like we found our little ranger," one of them jeered, their voice dripping with mockery. "How do you like the view from down there?" Jake's blood ran cold. The pit was deep, and he could see no way out. He was at their mercy now, a plaything in their twisted game. As the laughter echoed around him, he felt an overwhelming sense of despair wash over him. He had come here to protect the forest, to stand against the darkness, but now he was ensnared in it. "Don't worry, we'll make this quick," another poacher said, the amusement in their tone chilling Jake to the bone. "You won't feel a thing." The laughter continued, a cruel symphony that cut through the night air. In that moment, surrounded by the shadows that had haunted him since he first stepped into the forest, Jake realized the true horror he had stumbled into. The darkness was not just a fearsome presence, it was alive, and it was hungry for more than just the secrets hidden within the trees. As the poachers leaned over the edge, their silhouettes looming menacingly, Jake understood that he had walked into a trap far more sinister than he could have imagined. He had thought he was the hunter, but now he was the hunted, and the night held no mercy for those who dared to challenge its depths. Jake's heart raced as he tore through the dense underbrush, adrenaline coursing through his veins. The whispers of the forest around him had transformed into a cacophony of dread, the sharp snap of twigs underfoot echoing like thunder in his ears. Behind him, he could hear the poacher's footsteps, a sinister rhythm that chased him through the darkening woods. Each breath he took felt shallow, a desperate gasp for air as he pushed himself to run faster, the weight of fear pressing down on him. He burst into a clearing, momentarily blinded by the moonlight that poured onto the forest floor. Desperation clawed at his throat as he reached for his radio, fingers trembling. "This is Ranger Jake. I need backup. Now." His voice cracked, the urgency palpable in the cool night air. But instead of the reassuring voice of his colleagues, he was met with nothing but static, an electric buzz that amplified his isolation. It was as if the forest itself had conspired against him, swallowing his pleas for help into its vast, shadowy depths. Jake's eyes darted around the clearing, searching for any sign of safety. The trees loomed like sentinels, their branches gnarled and twisted in the moonlight, casting long shadows that danced menacingly across the ground. He could hear the poacher's laughter in the distance, low and mocking, a sound that sent chills skittering down his spine. They were toying with him, relishing the hunt. He was nothing more than prey in their twisted game. Suddenly, his foot caught on a hidden root, and he stumbled forward, arms flailing as he tried to regain his balance. Before he knew it, the ground gave way beneath him, and he plunged into darkness, the earth collapsing around him. A sharp pain shot through his ankle as he landed with a thud at the bottom of a pit, leaves and debris cascading down, obscuring the narrow opening he had fallen through. Panic surged as he pushed himself up, the realization of his predicament settling like a weight on his chest. He was trapped. "Hey! Are you okay down there?" a voice called from the edge of the pit, one of the poachers, Jake recognized instantly. The words dripped with mock concern, but the laughter that followed was anything but friendly. They had orchestrated this, drawing him into their trap, and now they were relishing the moment. Jake's heart sank as he pressed his back against the cold, damp earth, trying to steady his ragged breaths. "Come on, Ranger. This isn't how it's supposed to end, is it?" The taunting voice echoed above him, and Jake felt a surge of anger mix with dread. He had trained for this. He had dedicated himself to protecting these woods, to upholding the law. The thought of being outsmarted by these criminals ignited a fire within him. If he was going to get out of this, he needed to think clearly. "Let me out of here," he shouted, trying to sound more defiant than he felt. "You won't get away with this." His voice echoed back, swallowed by the thick foliage surrounding him. The laughter above him only grew louder, an unsettling reminder of his vulnerability. "Get away with it. We're just getting started," another voice chimed in, this one belonging to a figure Jake recognized from his earlier encounters. They were taunting him, and the realization sent a shiver down his spine. They were enjoying this. Jake took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. He scanned the walls of the pit, searching for any means of escape. The sides were steep and slick, but there were roots and small outcroppings that might provide a foothold. If he could just climb out before they decided to come down after him, he might have a chance. "Why don't you just give up, Jake?" one of the poachers shouted, leaning over the edge, their silhouette framed against the moonlight. "You think you can save this forest? You're just a rookie. You have no idea what you're up against." "I know enough," Jake shouted back, his voice stronger now, fueled by determination. "You're breaking the law, and I'm going to stop you." He began to inch toward the wall, testing his footing on the roots, but the laughter above him only intensified. "Stop us. You're alone out here, Ranger. You're out of your depth," the voice jeered, the malice evident in its tone. "No one's coming for you. You're just a little lost boy in the big, bad woods." Jake felt his heart pound in his chest, fear mingling with anger. He had to escape, had to prove them wrong. Gathering his strength, he started to climb, his hands grasping at the roots above him, the rough bark scraping against his palms. Each movement was a struggle, but he was fueled by the need to survive, to fight back against the darkness that threatened to consume him. "Look at him go," one of the poachers shouted, howling with laughter. "He thinks he can escape. What a joke." With every inch he climbed, Jake felt the weight of their mockery pressing down on him. But he refused to let them win. He reached for a particularly sturdy branch, pulling himself up with all his might. The pit seemed to stretch endlessly, but he could see the edge drawing closer. Just a little more, he thought, gritting his teeth as he pushed himself even harder. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from above, followed by a flurry of movement. Jake glanced up, his heart racing as he saw one of the poachers lose their footing and tumble backward, crashing to the ground with a thud. The laughter ceased, replaced by a shocked silence. "Are you okay?" another voice shouted, panic creeping into their tone. Jake seized the moment. This was his chance. Ignoring the pain in his ankle, he scrambled up the remaining distance, reaching the edge of the pit just as the poachers began to recover from their shock. He pulled himself over the top, his feet hitting the ground with a thud as he rolled onto the forest floor. Without looking back, he sprinted into the trees, the branches whipping against his skin as he dashed through the underbrush. The laughter had turned into angry shouts, and he could hear them closing in behind him. "Get him," one of the poachers yelled, their voices a menacing chorus. "Don't let him escape." Jake pushed himself harder, his legs burning, lungs gasping for air. He couldn't let them catch him, couldn't let them win. The trees blurred past him, their trunks like shadows reaching out to snatch him back, but he refused to be ensnared. The forest was alive with sounds, the rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs, but all Jake could hear was the pounding of his own heart, a relentless drumbeat urging him to keep going. He darted left, then right, navigating the familiar paths he had patrolled countless times before. But tonight, those paths felt foreign, twisted and dark, as if the forest itself had turned against him. Ahead, he spotted a faint glimmer of light filtering through the trees. Hope surged within him. It could be a campsite, a sign of life, a chance for safety. He pushed himself forward, determination overriding the pain in his body. "Jake! Stop!" The commanding voice rang out, slicing through the night air like a knife. It was Sheriff Colin. Jake's heart sank. He could feel the weight of his authority bearing down on him, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. "Get away from me," he yelled back, his voice trembling with fear and defiance. He could hear the sheriff's footsteps pounding behind him, the sound growing closer with each passing moment. "Jake, I'm here to help. Just slow down," Colin called, but Jake's instincts screamed at him to run. The poachers were closing in, and he needed to escape their grasp. He burst into a small clearing, the moonlight illuminating a scene of chaos. The campsite was abandoned, the fire pit cold and dark, remnants of their illegal activities scattered like ghosts around him. Panic surged once more as he turned to face the sheriff, who emerged from the shadows, his expression a mixture of concern and confusion. "Jake, what's going on?" Colin demanded, scanning the area as if expecting the poachers to materialize from thin air. "They're out here, Sheriff. They're hunting me." Jake gasped, his breath coming in ragged bursts. "I saw their campsite, they're poachers, and they've been using these high-tech suits to camouflage themselves." Colin's brows furrowed, his expression shifting from confusion to skepticism. "Poachers? Jake, Are you sure? You're not. Not what? Jake interrupted, frustration boiling over. This isn't some hallucination. They're out there, and they want to kill me. The sheriff hesitated, and in that moment, Jake felt a flicker of doubt. Was anyone truly on his side? He could sense the tension in the air, a heaviness that made it hard to breathe. Suddenly, laughter echoed through the trees, a chilling sound that sent a jolt of terror through Jake. The poachers were nearer. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach. They were coming for him, and the sheriff was hesitating. Colin, we have to go. Jake urged, his voice rising in urgency. We need to get out of here. But the sheriff stood frozen, eyes narrowed, as if weighing his options. Jake, I need you to calm down. Jake's heart raced as the thud of his pulse echoed in his ears, the weight of darkness pressing in around him like a suffocating blanket. He lay in the pit, the rough earth scraping against his skin, and an overwhelming sense of despair washed over him. Just moments ago, he had felt the icy grip of fear, but now, with the sound of footsteps growing distant, a flicker of hope ignited within him. He clutched the radio, the only lifeline he had left, and desperately called out for help. Colin, can you hear me? I'm in a pit. Please, you have to hurry. His voice was hoarse, strained with panic, but he fought to keep it steady. Static crackled in response, and for a moment, uncertainty gripped him again. Had he imagined the rescue? Was he truly alone in this vast, haunted forest? Just as doubt began to creep in, a familiar voice crackled through the radio. Jake, hold tight. We're on our way. Sheriff Colin's voice pierced through the static, igniting a flicker of hope in Jake's chest. Minutes felt like hours as he waited, the cold earth seeping into his bones. He strained to hear any sound of approaching footsteps, and finally, the faint rustle of leaves and snapping of twigs broke the eerie silence. He peered into the darkness, squinting against the shadows, and then he saw it, a flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, illuminating the faces of Sheriff Colin and a group of deputies. Jake, where are you? Colin's voice boomed, filled with urgency. Down here. I'm in a pit. Jake shouted, relief flooding through him even as he struggled to contain his fear. Within moments, they had located him. The sheriff knelt beside the pit, his flashlight casting a harsh glow over Jake's face. Hang on, we're going to pull you out. As they hoisted him up, Jake felt the cool night air rush over him, a stark contrast to the suffocating darkness of the pit. He scrambled to his feet, brushing dirt and leaves from his uniform, gratitude washing over him. Thank you, he breathed, relief evident in his voice. Colin clapped a hand on Jake's shoulder, a gesture meant to reassure him. You did good, kid. Now we need to find those poachers. Lead us to their camp. Jake nodded, though a lingering unease settled in his stomach. He recalled the campsite he had found earlier, the scattered remnants of their illegal activities. This way, he directed, leading them deeper into the woods. As they approached the campsite, Jake's heart sank. The area was eerily quiet, the only sounds the rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. It was right here, he insisted, scanning the ground for signs of life. I swear, they were here just a few minutes ago. Colin's brow furrowed in concern. They couldn't have gotten far. Keep your eyes peeled. The deputies spread out, flashlight beams dancing across the foliage, but as they searched, Jake felt a growing sense of dread. Something was off. The campsite was too quiet, too still. He approached a clearing where the remnants of a fire pit lay cold and untouched. There should be evidence, gear, anything. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life, cutting through the tension like a knife. The chilling laughter of the poachers echoed through the darkness, mocking and taunting. "Oh, did you think we wouldn't notice, Ranger? You're just a pawn in our game." Jake's blood ran cold as he recognized the voices. He had heard them before, lurking in the shadows. "No. This can't be happening," he shouted, panic rising in his throat. Colin's expression shifted, his face hardening. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. The laughter continued, cruel and relentless. "You really thought you could protect this forest? You're just a little boy playing ranger while we make the big bucks. Thanks for leading us right to our trap." Jake turned to Colin, desperation in his voice. "We need to get out of here. They're close." But as he looked into the sheriff's eyes, he noticed something that chilled him to the bone. There was no urgency, no panic, only a cold, calculating gaze that sent shivers down his spine. "Colin?" Jake's voice trembled, realization dawning on him. You knew." The sheriff's lips curled into a smirk, and Jake's heart sank further. "You were always too naive, Jake. Always too eager to protect something that was never worth saving. You're in league with them." Jake's voice was barely a whisper, disbelief clawing at him. "You've been working with the poachers?" Colin shrugged, his expression devoid of remorse. "They pay well, kid. You just didn't see the bigger picture. This forest, it's just a resource. A way to make money. And you were a stumbling block in our operation." Jake stepped back, the betrayal cutting deeper than any physical wound. "I trusted you. I thought you were here to help." "Help?" Colin laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the stillness of the forest. "You were never meant to be anything but a nuisance. But you've done well in leading us to you. Now, we don't have to worry about you anymore." The deputies shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another as the tension escalated. Jake felt a surge of adrenaline, the sense of betrayal igniting an instinctual fight-or-flight response within him. "You're not going to get away with this," he hissed, his hands clenching into fists. "Oh, but we already have." Colin's voice was low and menacing. "You've played your part perfectly. Now it's time for you to leave." As the realization of his impending doom settled in, Jake's mind raced. He had to think quickly. "You won't silence me. I'll expose you, all of you." But before he could move, the deputies closed in, their expressions conflicted but ultimately loyal to their sheriff. One of them stepped forward, a large man with a hard stare. "Jake, you don't understand. This isn't just about poaching, it's about survival. The forest isn't what you think it is." A cold chill ran down Jake's spine as he realized the implication behind the man's words. "What do you mean?" Colin stepped closer, his voice low and conspiratorial. "The forest hides many secrets. You think you're the hero here? There are forces at play that you can't begin to comprehend, a balance that must be maintained. You're an outsider, and we can't let you disrupt that." With a surge of adrenaline, Jake turned to run, but a hand shot out, grabbing his arm and spinning him back around. "We can't let you go," the deputy warned, his grip vice-like. In that moment, Jake felt a primal instinct take over. He had to escape, had to survive. He twisted away, breaking free from the deputy's grasp. "Stay back," he shouted, adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Jake, don't do this," Colin warned, but the desperation in his tone was tinged with something darker, fear. Jake darted into the shadows, weaving through the trees as the sound of footsteps thundered behind him. The forest that had once felt like a sanctuary now loomed as a labyrinth of terror and confusion. He could hear their shouts, the crackle of branches underfoot, but he pushed through the fear, driven by the need to escape the betrayal that had shattered his world. But the darkness was all around him, thick and suffocating. As he stumbled through the underbrush, his heart raced, and a sense of foreboding washed over him. He had to find a way out, had to warn someone about the corruption festering within the very system meant to protect the forest. Just as he thought he might escape, he found himself back in the clearing, the campsite looming ominously ahead. The laughter of the poachers echoed in his mind, weaving through his thoughts like a haunting melody. "You can't run forever, Ranger," they taunted. Jake's breath hitched in his throat, and he felt the familiar weight of despair encroaching on him. He was trapped, not just physically but mentally, the darkness closing in around him. As he turned to face the direction from which he had come, he heard the rustling of leaves and the unmistakable sound of footsteps. His pursuers were closing in. "Jake!" Colin's voice rang out, a twisted mixture of authority and desperation. "This is your last chance. Come back with us, and we can talk this through." But Jake shook his head, tears of frustration blurring his vision. "You've betrayed everything I believed in. I won't go with you." With every ounce of strength, he sprinted away from the clearing, navigating the dense foliage as he fought against the overwhelming darkness that threatened to consume him. The shadows danced around him, whispering secrets he was not meant to know, but he refused to let them win. And as he ran, the realization settled within him like a cruel truth. He was not just fighting for his life, he was battling a darkness that ran deeper than the forest itself. In that moment, he understood that the true horror was not just the poachers or the betrayal of Sheriff Colin, but the sinister forces that lurked within the very heart of the Monongahela National Forest. As the darkness enveloped him,